We need to draw on local knowledge. We need to draw on indigenous knowledge systems. We need to build stronger social cohesion. We need to develop connected networks at all levels of society and across our region, networks which talk to each other. This will enable timely decision-making that supports better planning and, importantly, informed actions before, during, and after events. Such initiatives can reduce the impact of these hazards and the woeful loss of life, property, the emotional distress that comes with it. And of course, if we can reduce the impact, we can of course look forward to much more rapid recovery. And the key to this is of course building resilient societies. And so that is why we have gathered actors from emergency services, policy making, civil society, and more. We say an ounce of preparedness is worth a pound of cure. Similarly, a foundation of preparedness can help us withstand the quakes of multipolar crises. Now, journalism institutions have a key role to play in ensuring the steady flow and critiquing of the public information that flows between all of these networks before, during, and after disasters. Journalists need to inform, educate, and entertain, but they must also ask the tough questions, challenge duty bearers, and also comfort their audiences before, during, and after crises. Of course, to perform this role, journalists and journalism organizations need to be aware. They need to be operationally resilient and functional. They must be prepared for reporting ethically in the mentally and emotionally challenging landscape of disasters. Truly, this is no easy task. And that is why this 3-day workshop is only the first step in an initiative that will span many months and carry on into the coming years. As we move from theory and concepts to implementation, to reviewing and improving on the existing knowledge, the existing systems, the existing processes that we have, so that we can build a Caribbean that is stronger, more resilient to hazards. So in closing, let me make special mention of course, the Media Institute of the Caribbean, our partner, the Caribbean Broadcasting Union. Of course, as you know, they're the representative of the World Broadcasting Union. We are also immensely grateful to our valued partner, United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, who are also here with us, and to our esteemed host, the Caribbean School of Media and Communication, CARIMAC, here at the University of the West Indies. I also salute the many experts in areas such as coordination, early warning systems, and other different fields within and outside the region who are bringing their valuable and hard-won knowledge and insights to this event. So it is up to us to take all of this forward. And so I thank you, and I wish us all, myself included, fruitful and truly action-oriented discussions and engagement over these 2.5 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. So colleagues, as Paul said, this is just one of the activities that we will be doing as we focus on disaster risk reduction. There have been preliminary discussions as well with Corinne about the possibility of a module to be developed for the students here at CARIMAC, and that's something MIC will be working on with them. While we're going to talk about all of the precautions we have to take when it comes to disaster risk reduction, reporting, and making our own media entities more resilient, an important part of the discussion that I hope will be raised is actually the preparedness and the stories that should be told way ahead of time, and then even post-disaster and what happens. And we had a very lively discussion late last evening about that, and there were definitely areas that I feel we do not touch on as much as we should as media, with a responsibility to the public that we serve, and we're hoping that that will come up. These 3 days are going to be very interactive and very engaging. So everybody should have their thinking caps on. Those of you who are with us here in the room and those of you who are online, I just want to quickly run through a couple of house notes and also the agenda. We are going to move into our panel discussion first, led by Mr. Wesley Gibbings, and from 10:45 to 11:30 after that panel, we'll have Mr. Franklin McKnight, who will talk about reporting in the field in times of disaster. And then 11:30 to 12:15, we will be joined virtually by Mr. Jim Clancy. And then this afternoon, we get into what I think is really the very interactive part of today, which will be how to develop a crisis communication plan, and then how to develop a risk assessment plan. And we'll be looking at these not just from the perspective of the journalists, but from the perspective of the media organizations and entities themselves. And we'll end today with a group breakout session. And for those of you who are here with us, we'll probably break you into 3 groups, and you'll actually be developing your plans, but each of you will be responsible for a different aspect of the organization or entity. For those of you online, there will be breakout rooms which are randomly selected, and you will be doing the same thing. And that's the lineup for today. In terms of house notes, for those of us who are here physically, we will have water located at the back of the room. And then we will have lunch served from 12:15 to 1:30, and there will be an afternoon coffee break as well. To our colleagues online, the 44 of you who are on, I think we're missing about 10, and we're missing 7 in room right now. But you all online can plan your day accordingly as well around those times as you join us. So without further ado, we will get into the meat of the matter, as they say. And we are going to start the panel discussion led by Mr. Wesley Gibbings. For those of you who don't know him, Wesley was founder of the Association of Caribbean Media Workers. He's also a co-founder of Media Institute of the Caribbean. In 2017, he received the Percy Cabozo Award in Washington, D.C., which was awarded to him by the National Association of Black Journalists. And he has been involved in media for many, many years, almost as old as I am, Wes. But he's a great mentor to many and a friend to many in this region. And Wesley's panel is going to really speak to living through the experiences of crises. Wesley?
Thanks a lot, Kiran. And yes, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces here, some of which predate mine in terms of longevity in the media. So I've seen Sanka here, and then of course we have Canute James in the back there, who has been in this thing for as long as I've been alive, right? Okay, so this first session really gets into the meat of the matter. And we have 3 distinguished media practitioners who have been on the ground covering various events, crises, tragedies, disasters. And I think that they are well placed to discuss with us what they see as the environment for professional coverage of disasters, crises, and so on. And I know that Kenton had some advice for us on the definitions and what we determine to be high up on the agenda for attention and what might not be. So we have Nancy Rock, who is a very distinguished Haitian Canadian journalist. She's based in Canada, and she's going to come up first. And Nancy is an award-winning journalist. She's the winner of the Ja Dominique Press Freedom Award. Her credentials are so extensive. I want to spend time on that here now would be to derail the agenda somewhat, because her credentials are truly impressive. And she's going to be followed by Peter Richards, who is St. Lucia born. Happy Independence, Peter. Happy Independence, Janet, as well. Bienvenue tout le monde. Parmi moi, St. Lucie. Yeah, so Peter, one day when I produce the St. Lucian passport, you'll know what I'm talking about, right? And then we have Kenton Chance, who is a far more recent vintage, but he has been all over the region. He has been one of the people who has been a virtual media first responder in Haiti, in the Bahamas, British Virgin Islands. And then when he thought he had seen it all, and Dominica as well, when he thought he had seen it all, 2021, and volcano St. Vincent and the Grenadines, which is his home territory. But we're going to begin with Nancy first. So Nancy, it's over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be among all of you. Thank you very much. And I hope you bear with me because the situation in Haiti, as you know, Wesley, is extremely complicated. I must say that I have assisted, I was on the field for many disasters in Haiti, especially in 2003 in the Gonaïves that killed with the tempest of Jane, 3,000 people. I do remind you that 3,000 people is the same amount of people that were killed during the September 11th attacks in New York, because most of the time they do forget to talk about that. So I was the correspondent of Radio Métropole in Montreal when the 2010 earthquake devastated Haiti at 4:53 p.m. That famous day. According to the SOM La Presse survey, La Presse is the biggest, most important journal in Montreal, Quebec, the earthquake which ravaged Port-au-Prince and its surrounding with its spectacular images of desolation and pain was the most significant event of 2010, according to 41.2% of those surveyed. It was the first ranked with its exceptional coverage, that disaster received in the Quebec media. According to Influence Communications, since 2001, that earthquake in Haiti has been the most publicized news story in Quebec over a 7-day period, more than the attacks of September 11th in 2001, or the inauguration of Barack Obama in January 2009. So, this is quite rare in Canada. May I remind you that this natural disaster killed more than 200,000 people, wounded about 300,000 others, and more than 1.5 million Haitians found themselves homeless, placing the authorities and the international humanitarian community before a colossal challenge of reconstruction in a country without land register or building regulation. Let us remember here that it is not the earthquake which killed and wounded so many people, but mostly this absence of regulation, allowing until now, as a matter of fact, people to build anarchic constructions wherever they want, however they want. So if an earthquake is a natural disaster in Haiti, we can say that it was also man-made, because nobody respected anything and the state was not applying rules and regulations to protect its citizens. Today, it's even worse, but before speaking about the profound multidimensional crisis Haiti is going through today, let me describe rapidly the role of the Haitian press during that terrible event in 2010. In fact, the picture of the Haitian media landscape presented at the time of the aftermath of the disaster by the international press shows truly, and it was true, a paralyzed sector, crumbling or destroyed premises of installation, insufficient staff, lack of income, difficulties in printing paper editions of both daily newspaper in the country, Le Nouvelliste and Le Matin. We can say that, as the rest of the country, the Haitian press was on its knees. According to an estimate made on May 12, 2010 by the Haitian NGO Fondation Knowledge and Freedom, FOCAL, I quote, in the very first moment after the earthquake, only Signal FM and Melody FM were on the air. Among the 50 radio stations in Port-au-Prince, 25 were able to resume their program during the month following the earthquake. That was indicated by Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporter Without Borders, in a text published online on April 9th, 2010. Almost 3 months of activity for the media operational center, the press is slowly being reborn. It took 3 months. The Haitian press also played a critical role during and after the earthquake. In 2010, local journalists were on the ground reporting on the situation, providing valuable information to both Haitian and the international community. They helped convey the immediate needs of the people, as well as the extent of the devastation. Haitian media outlets also served as a vital communication channel for those directly affected by the earthquake. Their reporting helped to raise awareness about the ongoing challenges facing Haiti and the need for sustained support and reconstruction efforts. The treatment of post-earthquake information in the Haitian media may have been influenced also by several factors, starting with their economic interests, with advertising revenue, the main sources of income in free fall after the earthquake. This financial shock pushed some media owners to quickly reduce their news or editorial rooms in order to reduce expenses. This choice is not without consequences on media production, to the extent that it may have limited the volume of production and restricted the choice of subjects to be covered. Because on one side, we had a flow of information, and on the other side, journalists were very few available. In short, the financial reality of the media in the aftermath of the tragedy can be seen as an element which, through a cascade effect, affected the framing and content of the information. Whatever the factors involved, the Haitian media focus more on, that's a shame, on the political domain than on the living condition of the victims of the earthquake. The analysis, for example, of three media, TNH, which is governmental media, Signal FM private, and the newspaper Le Nouvelliste, which is the oldest newspaper in the country. During that period from January 18 to 22, 2010, showed that political information occupied 56 to 60% of all broadcast programs. So the post-earthquake information in the Haitian media was therefore, in a certain way, influenced by political and or activist commitment, and thus led to privileging the political actors and actions to the detriment of the victims of the earthquake, its suffering and needs. I remember, for example, that I was the only journalist that was talking at the time about the people that were amputated, you know, and it was terrible what was going on, and they were not talking about it. So this raised the question about what the world community could have done differently to mitigate Haiti's suffering. The answer seems to be depressingly little. When a disaster strikes, aid groups normally count on something to attach themselves to: a stable government infrastructure, local organization, but none of those hooks are there in Haiti. So the intense poverty, the poor construction standard, a lack of infrastructure, the social chaos that plagued Haiti before the quake made dealing with its aftermath even more difficult. And emergency aid is never really sufficient to deal with the long-term economic and social consequences of a disaster. So Haiti really required a new level of international commitment to the unglamorous and painstaking work of recovery if the poorest country of the Western Hemisphere was to improve rather simply than be rebuilt. Unfortunately, the regime of the singer Michel Martelly not only did not rebuild the country, but the worst embezzlement took place during the presidential mandate of Mr. Martelly from 2011 to 2016 with the Petrocaribe scandal, a concessional loan granted by Venezuela in 2005. Thus, those funds, intended to support the economic and social development of Haiti were largely misappropriated, notably during the presidential mandate of Michel Martelly, who governed the country for 4 years. More than $4 billion were embezzled by the Martelly regime. The misuse of public funds had serious consequences leading to poverty, affecting employment, healthcare, education, and the right to food. The Haitian people continue up to this day to suffer from the after effects of these acts of corruption, which have deprived the country of vital resources and hampered its social economical development. So I will not go on with everybody that talked about this corruption, but I can cite, for example, Mrs. Ginette Cherubin, also Ricardo Santefes, the special representative of Secretary General of the OAS, in his work, Haiti Dilemmas and International Failures in Haiti. If you want the references, they're on the text that I sent to the board. Martelly will then resort to the EOS to impose his foe, Jovenel Moïse. The protests all over the country began following court reports that senior Haitian government officials had fraudulently used up to 3.8 billion in loans from Venezuela Petrocaribe program, and that the president at the time, Jovenel Moïse, was involved in corruption, as well as 15 former ministers and senior civil servants, including 2 former heads of government. Jovenel Moïse companies have been identified as being as the heart of the embezzle scheme. The rest is history. Jovenel Moïse, as you know, was assassinated on July 7, 2021. Since then, since that assassination, Haiti has lived in an interim situation without a head of state, without a parliament since 2022, and with a functional government, a situation which should have ended by calling elections in 2003, which was not, and led to the recent protest all over Haiti. In the meantime, gangs have taken over 80% of the capital and several provinces in the country. Since 2018, we have seen a rise in the power of armed gangs. From that year on, they were used by the government to block the rise of opposition demonstration. The more they were used, those gangs, the more strength they gained. People are killed, kidnapped, women raped on a daily basis. Crimes against humanity and massacres are taking place in total impunity. In such a situation, can you imagine the consequences of another natural disaster in Haiti? What kind of preparedness can be done? As a matter of fact, since 2021, Haiti has been facing interrelated and layered challenges threatening the Haitian population: health, safety, economic well-being. The COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the weak systems, increasing mortality rates, and widespread economic disruption. Additionally, the country's southern area hit by the devastating earthquake in 2021, causing widespread destructions and loss of lives, leaving hundreds of thousands of people needing urgent humanitarian assistance. In addition, Haiti is currently facing a hunger crisis, with over 4 million people, or approximately 40% of the population, experiencing food insecurity. Unfortunately, a devastating statistic we face daily is that 1 in 21 Haitian children die before their first birthday, primarily due to preventable causes such as malnutrition, inadequate access to healthcare, and poor sanitation. Following the earthquake of January 12, 2010, the authorities have installed a monitoring network, we must underline that, with several seismic devices and a station allowing better knowledge today of local seismic activity. But besides that, the country is not prepared at all for natural disaster. We must prepare to reduce vulnerability, and this anticipation must be carried out in all risk areas, which is about the whole country. We need to better monitor the construction rules and also act on the education and behavior of citizens, because that's very important. Schools must develop courses to sharpen reflexes through simulation exercises. Knowing that Haiti faces different threats, it would be appropriate to put in place also a national risk reduction plan. This has not been done. And he has been advised by the engineer recently before adding that the local authorities must be preponderant actors. But when will the elections take place in Haiti? That's another question. In the meantime, and in all matters, we can unfortunately say that the Haitian population up to now is totally left to itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Nancy. What a fantastic presentation. And partly because I think what Nancy was able to do was to paint a picture of the disaster that is Haiti at this current moment as not a single episode story. And I think that the same holds true for everywhere else in the Caribbean. Whenever we are confronted with the challenge of a crisis of one kind or the other, multifaceted in nature, several stories constituting the single story of the disaster or crisis, but certainly a before, during, and after progression of things that are based on historical and contemporary antecedents. So you see there's reference to media infrastructure and the preparedness of media, which is central to the response mechanism, but also is very important in the before section, where the media paint accurate pictures of where we are at the moment, the during and the after. And as a matter of fact, as she spoke about amputees there, I remember doing a story probably about 20 years ago out of Grenada, where I made the observation about the presence of a high number of amputees. I said, but what happened with these people? And that story actually began in 1983 with the US invasion following the collapse of the Grenada Revolution. So there was a before component of that story that needed to be told, and there is an after story that continues to be told. I happened to be part of the Commonwealth Observer Mission in Sierra Leone back in June, and the area I was assigned was on the border with Guinea, where a lot of people had sought refuge during the Civil War over 20 years ago. And I too observed that the line for people who needed assistance was quite long, and there were people who were dragging themselves along the ground. So that story did not end at the Civil War, which was a political crisis. And bear in mind that we're dealing not only with natural disaster, but we're dealing with crises of all kinds that sometimes one would feed into the next. So earthquake in Haiti 2010, you talk about governance issues, you talk about political crises. At the time of the disaster, you had the now, which was the preparedness, of the infrastructure, and then the governance systems in order to respond. And we saw what happened next, and Nancy painted a very graphic and very important and strong representation of what happened. And just by the way, the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network had a look at Petrocaribe last year or the year before, I can't remember when it was. And the situation in Haiti was described by one jurist, quoted in the story that we did as constitution and orgy of corruption. I don't know if you remember that point, Nancy. In Haiti, looked at what happened with Petrocaribe funds in Haiti at a time when they really needed it badly, and you see that a lot of it was ferreted out. So it now falls to Peter Richards, who has been there on the ground in Dominica twice, including the last episode, which was 2017, was it? And also has been throughout the region looking at stories, telling stories that relate to the before, during, and the after phases of natural disasters in his case. So Peter, go right ahead.
Thank you very much, Wesley. And and thank you to the participants. I took a note and said I had to particularly say hi to my friend, Dr. Canute James, as well as Corinne Vance. Of course, you know why I said hi to you. The Jamaica bun and cheese still hitting. So before I start off, I want to look at the possibility of sharing some aspects of my discussion here with you. I want to look at the whole question, for example, of I want just to show you some scenes of devastation that would have occurred, for example, in Dominica. I will just allow the video, not the video, but the shots to change. And so you will see, if I could just get it right, I hope I have it right here. This is Roseau, in the capital, Dominica, just after the last hurricane in 2017, when I came into the country together with some disaster officials. This time I was based in Barbados. Then there's trying to get, then this is again another scene in Dominica. So I'll just allow it to run. I'll just allow the scenes to show so that you could understand the scenario in which we'll be discussing, looking at the issues. Okay, as I said, I put these photos up there to, one, to shock you in some way, and two, also to bring to you the idea that probably I have been covering too many hurricanes in the Caribbean. I'm glad now, as Wesley would say, I'm glad I'm in his country, Trinidad, where they say God is a Trinidadian, so I do not have to look forward to earthquakes. I probably have to look forward to oil spills. But the question of covering disasters such as hurricanes, particularly in the Eastern Caribbean, and I say the Eastern Caribbean, and I am being more specific, the Windward and Leeward Islands, not so much Barbados, because even when I've been based there, I was lucky not to have gone through a hurricane in Barbados, but I went through one in St. Lucia, Dominica, Montserrat with Hugo, and so forth. What we find in most of these countries is that you find that the media organizations, not the media, when I say organizations, I mean media establishments, sorry, they are not really prepared for disasters of that nature. As a matter of fact, most of the media houses in these islands, even before the advent of social media, they were more or less weekly newspapers, and everybody would rely mainly on the radio. Television was not as up to date as it is. You'd get news, but no news on the weekend. So if an earthquake or a disaster would be occurring on the weekend, as they would say in the patois-speaking countries, crapo smoke your pipe. What we found is that training, the most basic thing for media workers, just as training was absent before a disaster, it is still in many cases in the Eastern Caribbean still lacking after a disaster. I will use more or less personal episodes to try and bring across the idea to you. The media in most of these countries, they relied mainly, it was mainly the radio, not so much TV. They had no social media until now. And even then, when you have social media, it is not open, or it is not something that everybody, all the media houses in the Caribbean would have a, let's say, a social media page so you could find out what's going on. And we relied significantly on ham radio. And in fact, in Dominica, when Hurricane David struck in 1979, Fred White became a national hero in Dominica simply because he was the only ham radio operator in existence in the country and keeping Dominica in tune with what was going on in 1979. Juxtapose that situation now to the last time, when 2017, when hurricane hit Dominica again. This time you had social media playing an influential role in that the prime minister and what have you, they relied significantly on speaking to their people using social media. But in 1979, in fact, as a matter of fact, even going further back, in my days going to school in St. Lucia, we had to rely on two things to know a disaster is imminent, especially hurricanes. The VG lighthouse would send up 2 red flags. So people, wherever you are, hopefully you could have seen the 2 red flags. And then the siren from the police station, from the fire station would go to allow you. And then you'd go on, the radio station would be on. But again, because we did not have because media people in St. Lucia and what have you at the time were more reliant on how do I save myself? How do I go protecting my home? Because that's an important aspect for covering disasters in the region. How do I safeguard myself? They would not go, for example, the media, or they would link to, I would say, the meteorological offices to just get an update as to where the storm is or what is happening. It was nothing confined to a discussion as to what preparedness you had to be in the mode you had to be in order to safeguard yourself. The media in the Caribbean in those days, as I said, relied mainly on officialdom. If the prime minister or if the minister in those days, they didn't have a portfolio minister of natural disaster or what have you, as we see now going forward. In those days, you relied on either the prime minister or the minister of home affairs going on the radio, and his only important message to you is to, as they say, move away from low-lying areas, go into high areas, or go into shelters. And some of the shelters were, alas, just like ordinary places. They were not built to accommodate any strong disaster or any storm coming through the region. In fact, I could recall in Dominica sitting under a house and watching roofs, trees, and what have you being blown away and moving out, and you're wondering, and all you could do is pray and hope that, hey, I will not get through, I will get through this scenario. If we fast forward now to this century, where, as I pointed out, social media and what have you is now becoming more apparent, more important in the coverage and dissemination of information. Before, after a hurricane, you would be surprised. And again, I am referring and I'm using more local experiences to try and bring the message across to you. We were not prepared for what would happen to the population after a hurricane. The first thing you would hear on the radio, if you're in a banana producing country, the government would turn around and say, well, the economic aspect, the banana trees have fallen, so many coconut trees and what have you, and so we'll take time. But the human aspect of what transpired, what occurred, how did it affect you, that was the last thing on their mind. As a matter of fact, when I looked at coverage of of the hurricanes afterwards, I made it a conscious effort to say, hey, the stories now should be human interest. How did that person survive? How did that person give me that first account of how did you survive the hurricane? How did you go about it? What did you do? What didn't you do? For example, and it was most interesting simply because in many of the instances after a hurricane, you'd be surprised to see houses that were built long, standing up to the rigors of storms with winds in excess of 150 miles. And this new building, because we had no building code at the time, and we still, in many other countries, we still do not have a building code. We still go and we build and we say, okay, this look nice and everything. And these new properties were destroyed as against the old buildings, whatever these people did in those days, whatever they did to ensure that they survived, that happened. We also have in the issue of when we look at hurricanes in today's technological world going forward, we have now mobile equipment, whether it is phone, whether it is video, camera, and what have you, that helps us record exactly what happens. We are now able to move around. When I mean move around, the fact is we could move around with a phone in our pocket, and that gives us the equipment we need to cover situations. As I said earlier on, many of the countries we do not have, for example, many other countries are now developing or putting in place disaster agencies to help bring across the messages that would have, that they want to bring out as a matter of fact, so the outside world could know exactly what has transpired. Technology today has allowed many health ministries through the Caribbean to host social media platforms. But in many instances, as we know in many of these Caribbean countries, the information on these platforms, even during normal times, are late and outdated. But that does not mean the platforms should not be used or should not be your companion, because in many instances, as I said, even though they are late, they still put out information there. The authorities use these platforms to inform their counterparts and aid donors outside of the countries of the developments taking place. Some host virtual news conferences at particular times of the day, therefore providing you with information. As I said, to me, coverage of earthquakes, coverage of disasters, particularly hurricanes, the most important aspect for me has always been the human aspect. What has transpired after? Let me put out that human story on a disaster. I think we'll go into the discussion later. I just wanted to set the scene. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that, Peter. Yeah, very important first-person testimonies there on the ground. Again, stressing the point that what we are usually dealing with at times of crisis is not a single story. It's not a single episode. There has been a tendency region-wide, certainly those of us who don't consider ourselves to be vulnerable, particularly in the hurricane season. And I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, as Peter reminded you. That happens, and what there is a over-reliance on, for example, the CDEMA situation reports. And sometimes we need to bear in mind that those reports tell a substantial part of the story, but there's a lot more to it. They don't go into what Peter describes as the human elements and the human stories. And recently, when we had an exchange with regional disaster relief people, they were concerned that journalists so very often run off on their own. In fact, I think those are the words that are used. So, we send the information, but you run off on your own because, you go on the field and we say, we're going straight. And when you turn around, all the journalists gone because the camera here, this one interviewing somebody, and that's because there's this distinction between the hard information and stories, or stories about people that need to be told. Now, Kenton Chance has been there, as I said before, and he in a number of different stories, situations. And so I want to bring Kenton in now because Kenton, as I said, all over the region, BVI, Bahamas, whatever. And then 2021, the first rumblings, and 2020 actually, and this would prove the point that even though we're dealing with a single episode of a volcanic eruption or volcanic situation, the story actually began long before the quote-unquote eruption. And so Kenton will tell us more about that. Go right ahead, sir.
Excuse me. Good morning, Wesley, and good morning to the fellow panelists, and good morning to the people in the room. I feel a little dated because I'm not being called upon as a facilitator. I remember the days when I was in training sessions with Dr. James about the CSME, and I always remember from that training session in Jamaica where he said that the story should always be about people, and he spoke about sugar cultivation and how you can write a story about that and always make it about people. I'd like to ask Wesley that whoever is controlling the platform, if you can, I prepared a short video about 2 minutes. I know 2 minutes is pretty long in the age of social media, but I hope you can endure it. So if that video can be played now, please. Or do I play it from here and share my screen? Okay. Experienced this before?
No, I didn't know how to do it.
Just one spot, right? Just dig out one spot, we see you. Just one spot, dig out one spot. Right.
Lucifer is showing us that it still has a lot of bang left because it is erupting again today, a very massive explosion 2 weeks since it has erupted. Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to play that because I think most of us might not have had, except for those people who live in St. Vincent or Montserrat, might not have had an experience with a volcano before. And it was my first, and sometimes the human in me hope that the only experience covering a volcanic eruption, but the journalist somewhat longs for the quote-unquote excitement, minus the fact that, a volcanic eruption is a very traumatic thing, as is the case with every natural hazard. But the challenge in covering the eruption of a volcano is that, well, first I might say there are some people, including civil Senegans, who hopefully would never have the opportunity to cover the eruption of a volcano, simply because, well, based on history at least, it has happened so infrequently. So the Lucifer volcano, the last time it erupted before 2021 was in 1979. So you can imagine that during that period, a lot of people had gone out of the media, some had transitioned to other things, and some had even died. So the institutional knowledge about covering the eruption of a volcano had changed significantly in those 4 decades. And not only had the knowledge, but as Peter went into in detail, the technology that was available to cover the well, in this case, the volcano had evolved significantly. I began covering the volcano in January, very early, I think January 2nd. I put a link in the chat there with my extensive coverage of the volcano. And my coverage did not begin when the volcano actually erupted explosively, but pretty soon after we got the news that it was effusing, it was, you know, releasing magma very slowly and quietly. So some of the things that I want us to think of about covering a volcano. I always make this point that a dead journalist, an ill journalist, or a seriously injured journalist is practically, well, if you're dead, you're useless, a useless journalist. So always the first rule, the first thing you must consider is self-preservation, your personal safety and security, and by extension, that of your family. So this is where preparation comes in. So if a hurricane is coming, you know that as a journalist, you might be called upon to cover the immediate aftermath of the hurricane. So you have to make sure that you are prepared. You make sure that you have food in your pantry, you have water, you have, very importantly, fuel in your vehicle, because you can have a perfectly functioning vehicle that has no fuel, you can't go anywhere to cover anything. You have to make sure that your computer is fully charged, that your devices are fully charged. If you have extra batteries, you have those fully charged. So I'm speaking about some of the very practical things you have to think about, because you can go to sleep today, and I hope this doesn't happen, but it is the reality of life, and wake up tomorrow and realize all of the conveniences that you had to produce news, they no longer exist. And you have to improvise. And that is the case. Like when I went to Dominica and to Haiti, to BVI and all of these places in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, there's no internet. I was only able to file stories because I was part of the CDMA team. And they had an internet that they would use to, send out their situation reports that Wesley was referring to. So preparation is vitally important. This is when you have to really pull from the deepest reaches of yourself as a professional, because the environment in which you're operating, it is a hostile environment naturally, and people who might in ordinary circumstances be very welcoming could easily become very hostile to you because of their own frustrations with their situations. So these are some of the things that I want us to bear in mind in terms of responding and reporting on natural hazards. I did a lot of coverage on the volcano, and largely as a single person. There were 2 people who were going out with me. I was the only journalist there. I was the only person trained in videography, in audio, and all of these things. I had a friend who was driving with me, and another friend who was going, who would help me to pick up equipment and take things around. And this is where your skill comes in, because you might not have that institutional support if you're a freelance journalist, and you have to still go out and cover the stories. Some people are affected to the point where even they themselves can't, you can't even practice your profession. Like there's somebody I saw a colleague in the participant list. I hope she doesn't mind if I mention her name, Rochelle Batiste. If you look at the last 2 or 3 clips of the volcano, there's a clip where there's a building, but it's a church where the roof is completely collapsed. Rochelle is from that community. And the northern third of St. Vincent was totally evacuated. Most of the people had left, like 1/5 of the country, about 20,000 people had left. So can you imagine you having to move from where you are, Your home is somewhere, you don't know what has happened to it, but you still have to function as a journalist. You still have to report for the nation. And just for context, one of the biggest issues in a volcano is the ash. So all of this thing that you saw the guy shoveling up and all of that, people shoveling the tractor pushing off the road, that is volcanic ash. When it is dry, it gets into everywhere. It becomes a big nuisance. It wrecks your equipment, it mashes up your vehicle, and all of that. But the thing about volcanic ash that I was really surprised by is just how heavy it is. So you might pick up a small bag, and when you lift it, you realize it's really heavy. So when it gets wet, it becomes like concrete, and it causes the roofs of houses to collapse. So imagine you are somewhere having left, and then you're hearing, oh, house roofs are collapsing where you're from, and you still have to function in that environment. So I want us to remember that as media practitioners, and Rochelle is saying in the chat that it's scary and emotionally draining, and that is in fact the truth, that sometimes you personally are affected and you still have to report. And the thing that I want to, the point that I want to make to you is that preparation is incredibly important. So I will stop here so that we'd have a little bit, some time if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. Wesley.
Very much for that, Kenton. Some very important points there. Again, the multifaceted nature of crises and disasters, because he speaks about, for example, the relocation of people from one part of St. Vincent to the next. And we would recall post-2017 Dominica, you had a mass exodus or an exodus of people out of the island. When Barbuda became depopulated, was it the same year? Moved over to Antigua, and all of the accompanying challenges that occurred. So the hurricane story became a migration story. It became a food story. It became all kinds of stories that would not have occurred, you know, at the time of the occurrence. And Canute wants to say something, and prepare your question in the meantime.
Thanks. Just to say that these phenomenon that we have to cover from time to time in various parts of our Caribbean, when they're explained to us and when they're told to people, they often come with a lot of jargon that we need to explain and decipher so people can understand what we're saying. But in addition to doing that, never forget that the most important element in our reporting of these disasters, people. People come first. It's all about people. What they're doing, what is the impact of this on them, their livelihoods, their aspirations. How can they fix their history that's been erased? How can they rebuild? So it's all about people.
Thanks for that, Canute. I see Nancy has her hand up, and then I see Chris Sergio is in the room, and Chris usually has a comment to make, but go to the lady first. So Nancy, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much for Kenton presentation. Unfortunately, I wish I would have been prepared more, because my colleague Jean-Claude, it's at the last minute that he asked me to replace him, because I covered a lot of disaster in Haiti, and it makes me a little bit smile when Kenton says that you have to be prepared. Let me give you an example. 2003, there was, I'm sure you remember, the storm Jeanne that killed 3,000 people in Gonaïves. Well, first of all, and I agree that the people are the most important, but in Haiti, unfortunately, it's politics that's the most important, unfortunately, as I said in my presentation, and every time it's the same thing. They don't care about the people, they care about politics, politicians. And in a disaster, unfortunately, politicians cannot cannot do much except use that for their own interest. But let's go back to 2003, for example. 2003, Jeanne came to Gonaïves, and when I arrived there, it was with a helicopter from the United Nations. And then some journalists came after. Well, when I arrived in the city, first of all, the only information that we had was that there was a lot of rain in Gonaïves. That's all we had. That's all we had. And when I arrived, I saw the city underwater. I mean, flood. It was flooded, totally flooded. And there was talking about preparedness. That's when the passion of your work comes. And for example, I took a tap-tap. A tap-tap is a public taxi, you know, a little bus, or, you know. And I asked him to, so I went on top of the roof and crossed, and I said, please, I will pay you to cross the town, because and the other journalists did not want to, because we were seeing already cadavers of animals, of people and everything. And I said, but I have to go to the hospital or the morgue to see how bad it is, because I could tell that it was really bad, and that what they said on the radio was not at all the picture that was going on, what was going on the field. And so I thank that chauffeur, that driver, who had that courage to bring me to the morgue. And when I arrived in the morgue, first of all, crossing the city, you could tell that it was a disaster. It was a humanitarian disaster, okay? And not just the rain that went on the city. And when I arrived at the morgue, I saw, you know, a lot of bodies that were ready to explode, because they had been there for a few days already. And I immediately, when I returned, I went on the radio and said that this is a natural, it's a humanitarian disaster that we have. It's just not rain. The government was not even aware of what was going on. The government was not even aware. The prime minister, it's by hearing me and others that finally they went and to see what was going on. So when you're talking about preparedness, it depends on which country you are in. In Haiti, if you don't have the courage to do your work, forget it. If you don't have the love of your people, forget it. Because everything is about politics, and a lot of, and I want to say that too, because that's terrible, and it's been getting worse and worse, is that a lot of journalists want to be paid to do their work. Paid by politicians, paid by organization. It's terrible. It's just terrible. So can you imagine? And now it's even worse. It's even worse. So this is a situation in Haiti. Some of now it's even worse with the gangs. Can you imagine that some of my colleagues are in connivence? I mean, they are working with gangs. They're being paid by gangs that are killing people. So preparedness, I know how important it is, but trust me, in Haiti, it's just so, it's just not people, the situation, the people do not matter. It's politics, it's money. And that's even more dangerous today, because I've been, since 2003, as a matter of fact, I've been studying climate change, and I have my master in climate change now, and I know it's going to get worse, and it's even worse in Haiti. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you an example. I have my company now, because I had my own company in 2010 to be able to help the people, to create jobs and everything. I've done some important forums in Quebec. And finally, we realized that not only that the government was not going to do anything, but they lied publicly in Montreal. For example, saying, the Minister of Commerce said, oh, now in a few days, you're going to be able to open your your company in 10 days. Up to now, it's impossible to do that. Can you imagine? That's, well, let me see, 2010, so that's 14 years after. And it's still not possible. And now with the gangs,
Nancy,
excuse me.
Yes.
I just want to finish, please.
Okay, go ahead.
For example, with the gangs now, how can you cannot even cross some provinces. So if there's a disaster in the south, you have to pay the gangs to go through, to be able to go through. Can you imagine? I just did for the first time in Haiti, this has never been done, a national campaign on with videos made on with intelligence, artificial intelligence. And I gave these videos free to all the schools, public and private schools, okay? And can you imagine that the agency, the government agency that is supposed to help the people in disasters, I offered them, and they knew about it a year before. I offered them those tools because they didn't have the money, they didn't have the tools for the people. Do you know that they refuse? They refuse it because they are how do you say that? They're making their own money. They want to have, the more catastrophe you have, the more they can ring the bell to ask the international community money for their own use.
We have to move on. Save something for your wrap-up comments because we have a queue of people who want to come in now. Roseanne, I know you have your hand up, but we have a contribution from somebody on the floor here.
Good morning, everyone. Kimberly Henry, journalist at CVM TV. Enlightening discussion by all the panelists, Peter, Nancy, Chance. I am looking specifically at Dominica, where I had my points down. I had the privilege of visiting Dominica last year, May. And what struck me more in Peter's presentation was more social media use. Social media was used to communicate with people. From my purview, going to Dominica in May, I think social media could be enhanced to, help the country more in recovering from the 2016 Hurricane Maria. So I have a question. How prepared, Peter, do you think the Dominican people are for an upcoming, God forbid, disaster? And do you think social media could be enhanced a little more when compared to perhaps Jamaica in order to enhance especially the economic grounds in Dominica?
Thank you very much.
Peter, just hold your response.
Okay.
We're running out of time. We only have 5 minutes left. So I want to, you could come to that with your wrap-up comments. You could respond to that. Roseanne.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So I want to thank the panelists for an interesting discussion. I also want to stress, because I am a lecturer and a researcher, not in media, but I see the importance of the journalism when it comes to research. And I am Vincentian, although I'm living in Jamaica, and I've been to Dominica to find out a bit about what happened there. And what is interesting, I hear the whole human stressing, and I'm wondering to what extent do journalists work with researchers? Because even as we think about the stories, we want to think also about how the stories are going to help afterwards, right? And so it's one of reporting the truth without favor. And it's also one in terms of understanding how persons are coping, understanding that psychosocial impact, which is something that I have become very interested in, but I try to follow media because we sometimes do media analysis because you cannot be on the ground, and also because sometimes you can't run the surveys that you would like as quickly as you would want to. So the media comes very important. And so we want to understand from that perspective of the media, how are people coping? What is important to them? What support are they getting? And what support do they need from a media, from a journalist, we can then formulate plans simply by what is being reported out there. So in a form, we can conduct media analysis from what the journalists are doing. And so when you stress people and the importance of getting that information, I think it's quite critical, but I also see it very lacking. Sometimes I wonder if and I heard one of the panelists said, I wonder if it's what is being presented or what is the story is dependent on how many clicks you will get promoting your own businesses, or if it's affected by politicians and how they might see what you're reporting. So some of these things come to mind, but if it's reported with integrity and if the truth, and if you work with researchers, then some of what you're doing can even be used to develop plans, psychosocial plans, or it might not be used to develop, but it can inform it in some ways, right? Because we can get that information. Because even from the volcanic eruption, I was able to look at that eruption through the lens of environmental justice. And Kenton's work and a lot of the other work that have been done is what I have read. Some of the videos, I had to go through hundreds, but it was those sort of stories that I read to look at the impact and look at that information through the lens of environmental justice. So I wanted to just stress that, and hopefully persons can comment on it later.
Thank you very much, Roseanne. We're running out of time, and I really want to keep things on track because you're on next, Franklin, and Franklin is going to speak very directly to some of these questions that arose. So I just want to give the panel the opportunity to respond very quickly to the question raised by my colleague here, and perhaps to what Roseanne said. Peter, Nancy, and then Kenton, as the youngest one, you'll close things off.
Well, Wesley, I think with regards to when one of the questions from the floor about whether social media has been enhanced. Yes, it has been, to the point that even down to 2017, the last hurricane to hit Dominica, at the time, you only had the two major networks, Digicel and Flow. Now you have an abundance. You have more social media companies out there. So yes, in that respect, it has enhanced. The people are, like I said before, unlike 1979, where it was word of mouth and putting up flags or siren or what have you. You know, before anything happens, it's on social media, and that's another problem. That's another discussion on its own, another disaster, if you want to put it that way, on its own. With regards to the researchers, I think, yes, I understand your point as well. But we also have to take into consideration that, as Kenton pointed out, when we go into these situations, we do not go there for, let's say, 2 months, 3 months, or what have you, so we could sit down. We go in there, it's like go and say what happened quickly, and that's why I said the emphasis to me, and as Dr. James pointed out, always remember it's the human factor, and that's where I would want to leave it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Peter. Nancy, very quickly, because we're out of time, practically.
I totally agree with her question about working with scientists. For example, I'm working with a group of scientists for the educational campaign on climate change in Haiti, because I think that you cannot talk about climate change without scientists that can explain, because that campaign is for the youth. So you need to be able to know what you're talking about if you really want to help the youth and the young children. I think it's very important, especially in climate change. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Nancy. Kenton, soundbite.
Dr. Smith, there's a reason why we are journalists, and journalism is they say the first draft of history. So I do appreciate your interest, but our interest in in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And I can also tell you that is the interest of the audience. They don't care about what caused it. They care about the impact and how that can be alleviated. I just want to thank everyone. I know we're out of time. It was an opportunity being here, and I wish you all the best in for the rest of your training.
Thank you very much, Kenton. Thanks, Chance, Nancy Rock, Peter Richards. Very stimulating discussion. I think it feeds into everything else that we're going to be hearing in the next few days.
I'd like you all to applaud our panelists who risk themselves to get the news out in the public interest. Thank you all. Okay, folks, we're going to have a 15-minute coffee break now. So to those of you online, you are free to get your coffee and a snack. We have snacks at the back of the room here, coffee, tea, and juice. So please help yourselves. When we come back, we'll have Mr. Franklin McKnight addressing us. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you all had a good break. We're going to resume now. And our next speaker is Mr. Franklin McKnight. For those of you who don't know of Franklin, just a little bit about him. He has been in journalism for more than 40 years. He worked at the Gleaner Company for 10 years as associate editor and Sunday Gleaner editor. He was founding managing editor of what was the Sunday Herald. And he also served for 10 years as news director at Grove Broadcasting Company, IRI FM. Over the past, he has worked as a radio and television presenter on RJR, CBM Television, and Nationwide News, among others, and he has been published in the New York Times and the Washington Post. He is founding publisher and editor of the Northern Jamaican community newspaper, the North Coast Times, which is now online on several platforms, and he hosts the weekly Frankly Speaking Jamaica podcast, and is still an active journalist and reporter. He's a graduate of UWI Mona, Columbia University, and the Thomson Foundation in Wales. He has worked for several years as an adjunct lecturer here at CARIMAC, and he's a consulting editor. So I think that he is very, very qualified to speak to us on this topic, because he's also a former president of the Press Association of Jamaica and the holder of the Order of Distinction OD Officer class awarded by the Jamaican government. Franklin, thank you for making the time for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. Mine is an interactive session, I'm sure you were told, and I'm allowed to call on everybody in the room, and those who are online, you are free to respond. If I could see your names and so on, I could call on you. But I'm going to be speaking about crisis reporting and disaster preparedness in the media. And as I say, I'm serious about this being interactive. And the first person I'm going to call on, and is the only one who knows I'm going to call on him, is Louis. And Louis is from UNDRR. And he's going to tell us this business of disasters. We hear a lot of you talking about natural disasters. As Louis will tell you, there's nothing called a natural disaster. Right, Louis? But you come. Tell us, what is a disaster? We want to hear what really is a disaster from your definition of you.
Okay, hello again. Okay, so the official definition of disaster on UNDRR is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society at any scale due to hazardous events interacting with condition of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity, leading to one or more of the following: human, material, economic, and environmental losses and impacts. So, as he said, and by this definition, the natural disasters do not exist. What exists are natural hazards.
Natural disasters do not exist. That's what he said. I mean, say it again. Say it again if it's true.
Natural disasters do not exist. What does exist are natural hazards, and the disaster come from the interaction of those hazards with the society, with the condition of exposure, with conditions of vulnerability and capacity. What we try to do, in fact, is to create a planification and strategies so those events, those hazards do not become disasters. And thus the fact that natural disasters do not exist.
Okay. Yes, it's just a brief response he was giving us. Natural disasters do not exist. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So I just wanted us to talk about disasters a little bit. And I've in preparing for this, I spoke with some people who are involved in disaster preparedness. And first of all, some of them told me that what they prepare for is not a disaster. They prepare for an event. Now, the language that comes out of this, as he was saying, a hazardous event can lead to a disaster. And the language of it is important. But I am asking all of us here to basically consider the interface, the interaction between reporters reporting journalism and that other side that exists that manages, monitors a response to disasters. Now, Peter, in the earlier session, mentioned, no, it wasn't Peter, it's Kenton, I think, mentioned that one of the primary concerns that the reporter should be involved with, should have, is for his or her own safety. Now, I can tell you, as an editor, I was not really concerned about the reporter's safety. I'm very sorry. I just want my story. I used to have a professor when I was in school who used to say, I'm not interested in what happened to you yesterday or what will happen to you and your family. I'm interested in a story. I'm employed here to get stories. So I'm not able to interact with Kenton, but if I have some reporters in the room, oh, seriously, and there's an event or a disaster or something is turning into a disaster, my first concern, I'm sorry to say, will not be the reporter's safety. I'm going to be saying to the reporter, go and get that story for me and just be accurate and just do the things that you know you're supposed to do. What would your first concern be, sir, if you were the editor? And can you just tell us just in one sentence?
So that the online people will be able to hear him.
Okay. Yes, of course. All
right, thank you. I agree with you. The first concern is, again, the story, but I also tell the reporter, make sure that we can get that story back here. So even if, no matter where you go, you must be able to get the story back.
Okay.
So those are the primary concerns. Getting the story, the reporter getting the story, and then getting it back to us at the office.
Beautiful. Okay.
But if you have no reporter, you have no story. Right? But just remember to have the microphone so that.
Yes, I just remember. Yeah. Let's say women sometimes think different from men. So may I just ask this lady here, what would your first concern be with your team there? Would you honestly be saying, or in the back of your mind, thinking about the safety of the reporters you're sending to do this serious story?
Actually, the story always comes first for me.
Not hearing you. Is the mic on? Is the mic on, sir? Okay.
Okay. So the story always comes first to me as a journalist. I guess now as a mother, sometimes I might think about my safety in the interim, but the story always comes first.
Story comes first. Story comes first. Anybody else as another view?
perspective of a university, because we do university broadcast, UETV, accuracy is most important for us.
Okay. Okay. All right. There's a
hold
gentleman
on.
there who wants to make a quick response too.
I think we all know the story of the goose that laid the golden egg. You know, you can't have the egg, you know, that golden egg without the goose.
Yes.
So, you know, I think it's really we must emphasize, we talked about the human interest stories and so on. How can we be human interested if we don't have humanity, first of all, for journalists? Thank you.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Absolutely, and I've been an editor myself. My first priority was always my newsroom, the people in my newsroom.
Your first priority was what?
Priority was always the people in my newsroom,
In the
because
newsroom.
without them, we get no stories.
Yeah.
And they need to be happy and taken care of. Otherwise, we're not going to be getting the best stories. As a
Well,
matter
Wesley,
of fact,
I had some
position
reporters who
in the media house, I had somebody who was appointed in a made-up position because the bosses got accustomed. What's all this happening around here? Why is everybody smiling? Why is everybody looking so happy? This is a newsroom. This is serious things we're dealing with. Sorry. Oh yes.
I was just gonna add that as somebody who works for a female editor-in-chief, indeed getting the story is most important. But when she sends us out there, she says, get the story, get it accurately, come back with the story with my cameraman as well. So it's not a situation of just getting the story. It's always get the story, be safe where you are, but if you have to step out a bit to get the story, get it. Come
get
back
the
to us.
story. Get the story. Get the story. Mr. Chris. And then we're going to move on.
As someone who has worked with Franklin McKnight, it was all, there was never anything he said about safety of his reporters.
Well, Mr. Sergio, I didn't remember that you were in the room, so I was being honest anyway. No, I was being honest and confession. Okay, now one of the issues that I really want to mention is that, well, first of all, let me just put the scene on because I have it down in the line, but we have used up so much time already. But I want to give you the scene. You are one or the other of these persons. So just think about it as from a reporter's point of view or from an editor's point of view. There's an event that is happening in the middle, in some 30 miles away from your newsroom. So it could be, you could be anywhere. We're talking about, you could be in Trinidad, you could be in Jamaica, you could be anywhere. But this is happening 30 miles away from your newsroom, from where you are. So you have sent a reporter to the scene. Now here are just two or three little things I wanted to conceive of. The reporter reaches the scene of what is really a flooding situation. So the area is sort of like a basin, and the reporter reaches the scene, and police have tapes and have marked off areas where you cannot go beyond that area. You cannot go beyond this point. You're heard as you approach, you've left your car or you've left your colleagues, you've heard that 5 people are dead. You're seeing on your social media platforms, because you're checking on your phone, you're seeing between 2 and 50 people dead in the flooding that has taken place, which has covered houses, etc. You can't get there yet. Your editor, some of you are considering yourselves as editors, some are the reporters. Your editor is calling and saying, we are on deadline, we are being bombarded. There are lots of stuff going out on social media. I want even 2 paragraphs. How many people are dead? I want you, social media, because we heard about, and I think it was Peter who said social media is almost a disaster now. I'd love to come to different ones of you and for you to tell me how you would respond. Emma, may I ask you, how would you respond to that editor who's saying it's my deadline, I've got to get something out on our social media pages. It's a deadline and we have to go now. How would you respond to that, editor? You have not been able to see everything yet, but you hear all of this.
I think I would report, I would get back to the editor by saying, well, you know, this is what I have for myself seen. This is, it's not the full picture, but this is, you know, what I have done, what I've
what is that?
observed.
What is that? What must I put out?
Well, only what you have actually experienced and seen for yourself, whatever the social media guys are saying.
I've got to write something. Emma, you're my reporter. We have invested in you. You are at the scene. I've got to go now. It's 2 minutes before we get this out.
Yeah.
You're iffy.
I know. I'm thinking.
You're on report. But you work with you, yeah.
I just came in.
Okay, and you have pineapple in your mouth, which is not the best position to be in.
Yes.
Tell the story.
Okay, so for me, good morning, everyone. My name is Keola Green. I'm a third-year student at CARIMAC. So for me, I would personally confirm what it is that I can see, what I know, and then say, but there are speculating reports, or there are other reports that they're more unconfirmed deaths, but in a later update, we'll provide you with more information.
So say that one more time. What you're saying to me in 2 sentences or 3 sentences?
So I can confirm that there are, let's say, 5 deaths. However, there are unconfirmed reports of about 50.
Okay. So where are you confirming these 5 from?
Well, from who is around the officials, authorities on the scene, I will confirm with them.
You confirm that's with officials. Yeah. You're saying to our reporters who are online and so on that officials will confirm the deaths for you.
Yes.
All right. Okay. I saw somebody's hand over
Chris, come in again. And so, where else? Put your hand up. Let me see.
I would start by saying that preliminary reports are that 5 people have been killed. The police attributed to the police, and tell them that, you know, in further updates.
But the police didn't tell you anything from what I said, you know.
Okay, well, the preliminary reports are that. But
so you're believing in the social media?
No, we could, our paper or station could not independently verify these.
Okay, all right. May I ask the lady right in front of you? Yes. Oh, you're full.
Donut.
Sorry.
Yes.
Kimberly Henry. I'm saying instead of preliminary, I would say it's alleged that 5 people have died from the disaster. We'll have more in further details.
Okay. All right. Wesley?
No, I see it as,
how would you deal with those as
attending to a thorough, a wide of thing that's water, sewage, debris, and whatever it is. So I will say this is what I'm seeing. Now the social media are the raw material, and some of it would be, a substantial amount of it would be sewage. So you need to be able to say that and to sound a word of caution.
A substantial amount of it will be sewage.
A substantial of it will be sewage. We know that from experience.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and even so, it would have to be verified. And there are techniques to verify images, whether they're moving images or still images.
I've not come back to my presentation, but I wanted to mention that because of social media and the references to social media this morning. Several people made reference to social media this morning, several of the commentators. Well, social media may be helpful as Wesley said, a lot of it may be sewage. Now, sewage is very important, right? And those people who know about fertilizer know why sewage is particularly important. Okay, so social media might be a point, a place where you might want to start some of it. But from what I gave you, there was nothing that could suggest for you to say 5 were dead, or even suggest preliminary reports. Preliminary reports from what you were saying may be the greatest, and I'm an editor at the other end, the greatest number of social media sites you are looking at are individuals who are saying 5, 15, 50. The most that you could say from that social media picture is that there are reports of fatalities, but we are unable to confirm any. That's the best that you could do. Now, social media complicates things in the present circumstances. I think it was Peter who was mentioning that there were many more entities in, I can't remember whether it was talking about Dominica, but they had started with just Flow and Digicel. But in any case, the various social media platforms we have and the multiplicity of things that can come at you can complicate things. In these circumstances, the reporter and the integrity of the reporter is very important to be able to flush away things that are not necessary and things that you can't trust. So I was also mentioning that natural disaster or a disaster of any kind does not have to be national. Does not have to be national. It doesn't have to fill up the whole space. We know, for example, that many of these that we saw, for example, we looked at what St. Vincent, the scope and scale of it will be so wide that everybody would be affected. They're going to take you back, and when you get some time, you can look back. And in Jamaica in 1979, we had some floods in a place called New Market in St. Elizabeth, in Western Jamaica. New Market floods. Some rainfall, significant amount of rainfall took place, and an area of about 600 acres of land was covered. Up to 90 feet deep, up to 90 feet of water on the ground. The National Works Agency said there were 85 billion gallons of water released in the area in 24 hours. And that this type of event would not, from everything that they have seen, could not take place before another 50 years or so. It doesn't happen easily during one's lifetime. 41 people were killed. Now, this is many disasters over the Caribbean region do not kill significant numbers of people, but as many as 41 people were killed in this particular event. Not all of them in New Market itself, in St. Elizabeth. Now, what was happening there is that basically everything was destroyed. And the focus of the government itself at the time, in the late 70s, was to get a lot of resources down there. Now, interestingly, I want to show you that in Jamaica, there's an infrastructure, and I don't know who could, if anybody could tell me exactly what similar like this exists elsewhere in any of our Caribbean territories. But every parish in Jamaica, the 14 parishes, 13 when you combine Kingston and St. Andrew, as they are for this case, every parish has what's called a disaster preparedness committee, a set of people who look about and think about what they say are events that may occur and how they are to respond to them. Every parish in Jamaica has one. They have a certain amount of resources. The municipal corporation, formerly called parish councils, those have meetings. And those meetings take place every month where they make an assessment. In all the major communities in the parish, there are people identified who feed back information to these committees. So should something go wrong in any parish in Jamaica, there's an organization that works through that. Now, when disasters happen or when events happen that leads to disasters, very often those people are ignored. Very, very often. But they should not be in the aftermath of that event. And I'm not sure about the representation in the room, but can anybody tell me exactly what happens in anybody here from outside of Jamaica who can tell me what sort of structure we have to deal outside of the capital or in the various parts of the community? Can you help me? Here's a gentleman here.
With the mic. Oh, yeah, great, thanks.
Thank you. Good morning. Ursula Charles Jr., Antigua. So we have a National Office of Disaster Services, and we have district or disaster districts. So they are dispersed in the various communities made up of mainly volunteers, not paid human resources, and they're responsible for not only planning but for shelter management in the parishes as well. Exactly.
Do those committees, what do you call them?
The disaster district committees. So the disaster.
And do they have resources? Do they get resources
from the main Office of Disaster Services? Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. That's Antigua. Anybody else can help us? Here's a gentleman right up front here.
The regional corporations in Trinidad and Tobago, which is the system of local government. Each region has resources, a space, and so on, and machine to deal with the event of a disaster.
Thank you.
The district organizations.
Can you hear? No, they're not hearing. Don't know what's happening.
Well, it's these organizations, and they do a lot bulk of the work, as you said. They're volunteers, and people actually listen to them. They're being incorporated more and more as to what is happening.
They're not a part of the government service.
No, they are voluntary, but they're doing much more because they know the communities that they're serving. And I think it's quite obvious now, and governments are picking it up all over the world, that people who are working within their communities are the ones who can relate better to what is happening in particular areas.
They know.
Because they know.
Yes.
I think it's district emergency organizations.
Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Trevisa, representing the Red Cross. I volunteer with the Jamaica Red Cross, but I've also worked with the International Red Cross. And I'm not representing any other country because you had asked about the structure in other countries, but I just wanted to mention, since you spoke about existing systems in place to help with preparedness, the Jamaica Red Cross actually trains community disaster response teams that are, and these are persons that are made up from the community, members from the community, and we equip them with the knowledge, the tools, the resources, so not just the actual knowledge, but also the tools that they need, so that when a disaster happens, they are the first responders on the ground who already know what it is that they should do. And what we do is integrate them as part of the national disaster management, in our case, ODPEM. So they're assigned to ODPEM and to work with the parish disaster committees that you mentioned. So just to add to the discussion about an additional structure that's in place for disaster preparedness.
And since you're there's such a rich resource, how do you define a disaster?
Well, from my recollection, a disaster is anything that it sees a capacity of the affected community to respond. So not every event that happens is a disaster. And I think one core thing that we need to remember, well, for the journalists in the room, is that when reporting, something can impact a community, but it might not be a disaster, but that doesn't mean it should not be reported on. So we have to remember the importance of communicating the big impact of the small events that sometimes tend to get overlooked.
Roseanne Smith, when comes in, wants to come in.
Can I?
Roseanne, go ahead.
Yes. So the CDRT that was just mentioned, I want to say that exists in St. Vincent. But as the name suggests, I find them to be more response team. And you're talking about disaster preparedness, which they do have some things, but what I, based on research, is that they tend to show up or do most of their work if there is a disaster. Outside of that, many times they are inactive. And a lot of times these community groups are non-existent until there is a disaster. So St. Vincent, in terms of a structure, rely on a lot on the CDRTs and also volunteers who might form themselves into community groups. But the problem, or the challenge rather, is that when it comes to disaster preparedness, which is different from response, there is some weakness there. And even in disaster response, as you would have mentioned, there are times where they feel neglected, like national or whatever persons come in and now they are not needed anymore. And that is something that came out based on research again from the volcanic eruption. They felt that they were neglected. And so I wanted to throw that out there.
Thanks for that. Jaka Wooding.
Hi, Jaka Wooding from St. Lucia, but based in the British Virgin Islands. And what we have here right now, disaster preparedness and response for the most part is led by the Public Works Department. We haven't really seen a strong formation of community groups. So we have the DDM as well, the Department of Disaster Management. But recently, following the impacts of Tropical Storm Felipe last year, the department put out calls to develop a register for members of the corporate community who are willing to volunteer their services and their equipment to assist in disaster preparedness and in response to critical situations.
Great. Okay, now, I was talking particularly about how do we respond to social media, and I made a reference to it by bringing that scene of going to a particular place and seeing coming on on your phone, because we can't ignore it. We cannot ignore it. And sometimes they have facts in there. Sometimes people are reporting the facts. Sometimes people just trying to get likes, we know, but sometimes my position is that we cannot ignore them. Do we deploy resources to check what social media has to say? So Sergio, can you give us a sense of how you, what would be your response to that? Do we, in mainstream media, deploy resources to check?
No, man, send a report about them story, which is all about the facts. I would ignore social media in that respect. What my reporter brings back is what I'm going to go with when I go with social media, not at all.
But social media is a network of reporters, isn't it? I mean, it really is a network of reporters, is it not?
That's what I was going to say, yeah. I mean, I don't think you can ignore them, but you can maybe apply some kind of filter. It's difficult to say, but filter what seems real, who the source is, for example, of a report or a video or something, and check that way. Do you know? Do a little check if you can.
So for me, I love to pride myself that I'm probably the youngest journalist in Jamaica with the least social media intake. But as Emma said, you can't ignore social media because in fact, there's somewhat some facts in what the citizen journalists are reporting. For me, if something breaks on social media before the traditional media, I go to the comments. And I read comments and I laugh for a moment at some of them. And then I say, but there's some there's some method to the madness that they're saying, and I try to pursue that angle, and I pursue the angle from authorities. So I might need to call the police, I might need to call somebody from NWA, I might need to call somebody from ODPEM, etc.
Verification. To see if it's true.
Well, working in a media house, one thing I know about social media is it's instant because they don't have the regulations that we will have within media houses. So sometimes the information may be factual, but we can report on it unless we have sources to actually make sure it's accurate on our end before we put it to the public. An example would be in Barbados, let's say shootings. Not right away, we will get it from the police that there is a shooting, but we will see on social media somebody post it. That allows us to follow up on that incident. So because of social media, we were able to get the story, to follow up on the story, to then put it out in the public.
Yeah, because these are real people, and these are real people, and their story, they're on at different locations. They have ideas. Sometimes they're in a place where you are not able to reach anybody, and so you can start there. But don't believe it simply because it's written down or somebody's saying so. That's where you've got to start. Take it on like that. So I wouldn't throw them all out together. I would work on them even in disaster cases. All right, and this is one of the things that I really wanted to ask. For example, again, is there a place for cooperation? Small, only yesterday I was learning about two small internet. There in Jamaica, several small internet stations. I'm sure that they exist all over the Caribbean, and they have some resources, and they're in some particular places. You would get some quality of reporting out of them, but are we using them? Is mainstream media in particular? Are they being used? Are they being connected? Is there any way of cooperating with entities like that? If something happens major in Montego Bay, for example, major, and you're in a newsroom in Port of Spain, how do you get that information? If you want to get specific, if you want to get some details, do we have any way? Do we have lists, contact lists, names, people all over that you can communicate with? In general, no. In general, from the people I was talking to yesterday, very little contact with any place outside of the country. Big stations, like 106 in Barbados and so on, several in Trinidad. They have connections with people in Jamaica, but even here, we don't have a lot of that connection. So is there a place for that, for national and traditional outfits? Thank you. Same idea, cross-border connections, again, between different places. Do you have contacts outside of Barbados with agencies, media houses, or people you can check things with?
We can, yes. We will have contacts with the other media houses, the main media houses.
Main media houses.
Yes.
In capitals around the region.
Because you can rely on the traditional media house to get it right, rather than go with anything else.
Rather than
so we get it directly from them.
Yes. Okay. Great. All right. One of the things that I was going to talk about with, but I've already done so, is that matter of reporters staying with stories. I remember during Ivan, in a newsroom where I was, almost everybody volunteered to stay that evening. It was, communications were not as good, but evening into night, when it was being expected in the evening and night, almost all the reporters, male and female reporters, volunteered to stay on, just get some food, get things together, and they would be willing to get out there as far as possible that we could. And that's a tradition that is well known around here in Jamaica. Again, doesn't have to be national. We have had several incidents in Jamaica. I'm speaking a lot about the Jamaican situation. For example, in Cave Valley, in middle of the country, there have been several flood events and major damage from those flood events in that particular area. And there are millions and millions of dollars worth of loss. And we consider them disasters because of what the damage are. Communities unable to help themselves is what I picked up from the people involved with disaster preparedness. All right, then I've gone through that. Tropical storm Ida. Now, one of the things I'd love. Go ahead. Not working. Yes, no, better.
Okay. One of the things following on from that little point you just made is one of the benefits of social media reporting is that you've said several times it doesn't have to be national, but the social media aspect that's kind of useful and interesting is the that it's local. You know, it's very much, this is what's happening on my doorstep, sort of thing. And this happened quite recently with that storm surge incident in Montego Bay and Oteria. And the rest of the country didn't really know what was going on. They just thought it was some kind of cold front. But these were local, very much local, and that's a useful perspective to have.
All right, I'm wrapping up now and just mentioning one other case to you. Recently, and Emma mentioned that there was some damage on the north coast, northwest coast from some storm surges. Huge cruise ships, for example, are battered against the port sides and so on. And the pictures came in from social media, and then they were followed up by reporters in major newsrooms around the place. But I remember after that 5.8 was it earthquake at the end of August sometime late last year. Within 2 weeks or so, there were several people who were reporting earthquakes, and there was nothing happening. But you would see something go out on social media, and somebody in a western part of the country would say, "Yes, I felt it. Did you feel it?" And somebody in east would then say, "Yes, I felt it." Nothing was happening when you checked the unit at UE. So we have got to be careful of that. I'm just wrapping up by making these particular points. I'm going to give you 30 seconds out of my 60 seconds.
30 seconds out of your 60 seconds. I felt the psychological impacts of the earthquake the other day, but I'm a journalist. I didn't report anything because, I know what was happening. But when the earthquake happened, I was privileged to say, I don't have to check on my community in St. Mary because we have a sturdy disaster risk preparedness team in my community. We even have a radio community station, St. Mary Jeffreytown. So I just want to feel bragful to say that when you say communities have a prepared team, every parish has one, my community perhaps have the strongest of the island.
And I know that they do. Yes. So I really want to thank you. But my points, and you might remember something else, but here are my 5 points. The first one is that check what disaster really means. Use a definition that means a community or area becomes vulnerable or cannot help itself. Social media is useful. Some of it I'm borrowing from Wesley. Some of it is a lot of sewage, but sewage is useful. I want to say, make the connections that you can with other media entities outside of your area and outside of the country where you are. And I particularly like to say that disaster doesn't have to be national, doesn't have to be the whole place. And then you have some other considerations. That's my 4. You will have at least 1 more. And thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Franklin. Very thought-provoking. We couldn't agree on everything because you have pig sewage, chicken, human, etc., each with different qualities. And but you just need to be aware that that's part of the torrent that comes your way at times of peril and danger and crisis. And I'm using different words interchangeably here. But as Luis reminded us, there are very clear technical meanings that we need to be acquainted with so that we don't go around using the wrong terms, the wrong words that would convey a wrong message. Only in my newspaper column yesterday, I explored in passing the whole question of genocide, which I think is the obvious conclusion out of what's happening in Gaza, yet the ICJ ruled that perhaps they fell short of defining this as genocide. But I was saying that, you know, as a reporter on the scene, witnessing judgments from time to time. But we're going into another phase of it that looks at a different perspective, a different approach now, which is the human interface. So you're out there the communities, people from the various activist organizations that might be present as NGOs and CSOs. And we have to present on the question of interviewing. You know, what about interviewing makes this so important in telling the story? And we have Jim Clancy, who is a US broadcast journalist, and he's best known as a former correspondent and anchor on CNN International. He's a recipient of George Polk Award for his reporting on the genocide in Rwanda and other notable awards. Prior to his joining CNN in 1982, Jim Clancy was a national correspondent after an extensive career in local radio and television in Denver, Colorado, and San Francisco, California. He's the founder of ClancyNet Media Consulting and is still involved in issues of journalism, human rights, and particularly human trafficking. Jim is no stranger to Jamaica and to some of you because he is a regular on the Media Institute circuit, and he is a valuable asset who has been with us from the early days of MIC and the Caribbean Investigative Journalism Network. So I'll pass the floor to Jim Clancy. I was going to say something off the record here. Because I was going to relate an instance where a bank, a major bank, recording is still in progress, right? But okay, no, that's okay. Yes. They launched, credit cards were very new to Trinidad and Tobago at the time. So that tells you what I'm talking about. And they launched a new credit card. And I was head of news at a television station. And I said that the story is what's going to be the impact of the advent of credit cards, because they weren't the first bank to launch a credit card. So but the reporter attended the launch, but the story that the reporter was expected to come back with was a credit card story, not the credit card story, ribbon cut speech, say, or whatever it is. And the journalist made a pretty good effort to do that. The next thing that happened was that I got a call from the chairman of the board of the media house. And I had to be as respectful as I could be. And I said, I'm really sorry, but this is what I'm hired to do. To do this story, I don't see the launch of a new credit card as a story in itself. It can get a spot, and maybe you could pay for some advertising and get your content there. But the advent of credit cards in a situation where people are not very used to plastic, to me that is the story. So the story incorporated what another bank had done, and this one, and the service fees, and and of course that story went on to become one of the stories of the time, because the more people got credit card, the more they were getting into debt and so on. And that credit card is one of the most the worst examples of capitalism. I mean, it's the crudest, most vulgar function of the capitalist society, right? Not that veering on the other side of things, but no, we know, right? Anybody has ever been in credit card debt? Well, you don't want to be, right? So in time, as time progressed, people realize how important that story is, and that the early alert. This was an early alert, There's a little story, and I think that came from the launch, like all these standpipe opening. You have every time election time, there's something opening, somebody installing some facility. I said, never come back to my newsroom with a standpipe story. They turn the tap and water come here for the first time. The people that you're paying attention is people who have to turn the tap to access the water. How frequently will that tap have water? Will it satisfy their needs and whatever it is? But don't come up with those ribbon cutting footage. Okay, it didn't last much longer, to tell you, in that place. But so it's in part. So that's just a long. I went too long on that one, but to make the point, yeah, there are these interests that you need to be in, and so sometimes public perception. Although one thing I can tell you, and I can say so with a lot of certainty, is that most journalists that I know of, and I interact with the journalists throughout the region, do not leave their homes early in the morning to set out to do stories to sell more papers or to bring more viewers. That is not in your consciousness whatsoever. I mean, who was operated as a reporter? Tell me, Chris, you ever left home in the morning? Because Gleaner could sell more papers today if I report, right? Yeah. I don't accept that accusation. Somebody actually said it this morning, right? I can't remember who, and another thing. But so the thing is that, yeah, you have all these factors at play, and there's a challenge of the journalist now, because you have and I'm going to make the point in another slide about, so you have the journalists and you have their media enterprises, and sometimes they don't always coincide in terms of value systems. So that's why I asked the question of what is journalism for, as opposed to what is your media enterprise there for? They have a board of directors, they have investors, they have a constituency that would be supported by advertising and people who would be buy.
Well, I have to hear this.
Oh, that's online. Yeah. So I kind of knew it would be in that direction, especially from you, Sanka. So those are valid concerns. Yeah? Those are very valid concerns. The other word of caution in terms of the social media people, when you get hired as a journalist, and I think most of us here have at some stage worked as a journalist somewhere, you start taking onto yourself a kind of professional, seeing yourself as having a professional obligation. This is what you're being paid for, to be truthful, accurate as possible. Because it's in your own self-interest, because the day you get catch lying or misrepresenting whatever, your name call, you're in trouble. The people who go and set up an X account or Facebook or even launch a blog, and I'm not pointing on the, right? I have a blog. I do a blog in addition to my journalism. Yes, I do follow it. But they don't necessarily need to subscribe to any professional code or anything, and you find an increasing number of instances, particularly around times of instability, where people are seeking out information. If you notice, there's always an increase in the instances which have misinformation and disinformation at times of crisis or emergency or heightened concern. We know that to be the case long time at election time. Suddenly, you have these people who are launching quote unquote news websites. There's one, I'm going to write about this one of these, I'm not going to call the name. A so-called regional news outfit operating online that becomes extremely prolific at election time only. And they tend very much to focus on one contestant over the other in a number of, not a single country, not one only. Okay, I'll write about it one of these days. So you have that to contend with. And what you notice that at times of emergency, and it might not apply across the board everywhere, established media tend to play a stronger validating role when it comes to life and death matters. So if you could have 1,000 WhatsApp messages making the rounds. If people need to find somewhere to get food or to get protection for the children and the family or whatever it is, and you have 1,000 WhatsApp messages and you have a single dispatch on radio, single authoritative dispatch. It's not somebody, a broadcaster, open the telephone lines and say, okay, here we have Mary from Portland. No. Your broadcast will play a validating role over most of the other things that people are seeing. That's a kind of general, and radio is very important in that regard. Kiran would probably get into that because radio plays a leading, validating role, particularly at times of crisis. I wrote about the instance in Belize. We have Deidre from Belize online here. The role of a station called Love FM, following, I can't remember the thing. Deidre tends to be very vocal, so she'll correct me if I'm wrong. I think it was 1995, where there was a hurricane that affected Belize. And that radio station went with their OB equipment, and they were driving all over the country, broadcasting. Well, listen, here is destroyed. If you want shelter, emergency shelter, 2 corners down from Ramesh grocery shop, near where the big almond tree is, you could go there and they play that kind of role, right? So that's, I think sometimes we kind of diminish the importance of so-called mainstream media. Of course, you have mischief and you have agendas and you have all that other foolishness, but at a large extent, so the mainstream media have not yet lost that point, although it can happen, and there are other issues we're going to discuss on another occasion, where the advent of AI, for example, is playing a huge role. UNESCO is looking at it microscopically right now in the Caribbean, and it's important that we look at that, and that at the same time we look at what are the possible responses. And some people here in the room would know, Paul would know, that I'm a strong advocate of media and information literacy as the ultimate solution, because what that does, it addresses the receptivity of audiences to the material. If you have a higher number of people who are skeptical and they investigate and interrogate everything that comes before them, but whether it is through mainstream media or social media, then you will start to win some of that work. People need to know more. AI has added an extra level of challenge when it comes to that. Right. So things happen, and you have all of this stuff that we just covered. I know we could have done a whole session on that. What are some of the obligations? And some of it is covered by Jim and some of the speakers before. We have to protect ourselves. So here I am addressing both the professional communicators and the journalists. Right, so you have to protect yourself physically, physical harm. And I didn't put it here, but we were speaking about it in the break. Emotional harm. Jim would tell you, Jim covered the Rwanda massacre, for example. And he said that it has never left his consciousness. What he witnessed there never left his consciousness. Somebody talked earlier about earthquakes, and everybody, I would say half of Trinidad and Tobago experienced earthquake PTSD after the episode in 2018. Every night you were feeling an earthquake, You check the Seismic Research Center, nothing. PTSD, right? So you have to guard yourself again, protect yourself against the prospect. A crisis happen, an emergency. How many of you have covered crime? The reporter said covered crime, right? So you've probably seen your share of injured people. Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, a lot of people don't realize what reporters go through at times, you know. So you have to protect, if you're with an institution that's promoting disaster relief and disaster recovery, then you need to protect from legal and other things, because if misguided misinformation regarding safety issues where somebody can be harmed as a result, or property can be damaged as a result of that misinformation, there's legal recourse and the threat of legal action, and of course of ethical harm, because the question again, small societies, everybody kind of know one another, or know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, right? So there's an ethical question that arises there too. Where do you place the most emphasis? Now, a colleague there who asked, who chimed in when we talk about crime, coverage of crime, that's a question there too. Haven't we noticed that people from one particular class, you know, from what we might call the upper crust, we are far less liberal in disclosing information about them than we are about regular, average, everyday people. When I was last year, when Kiran, 2 months ago, or last month, when last we were here in Jamaica, last month, and there was a story in a newspaper, I'm going to call the name Chris, and there was a shooting near what is it, the Prime Minister's residence or somewhere there, and the newspaper, in my view, was bold-faced enough to say, well, the shooting involved the son of a prominent businessman. But we, the newspaper, have decided not to disclose his identity. Now, if that was Jim Clark from the back there, you know his name, age, who his mother is, his father, where he went to school, how many O-levels he have. So we have all these things that happen too. And to me, those things harm. They cause harm, they disrupt your credibility because you are seen to be favoring one towards the other. That's why when I address the question of treatment of crime and treatment of stories, and that can cause ethical harm. People seeing you as not being reliable or always very truthful. If you decide that, you know, you're going to favor one over the next, or because that is my uncle or whoever it is. I was telling Chris and others a story about me being quoted by somebody from my own newspaper. And I never said anything of this sort. So that's another story. So you have to maintain trust and credibility. If that is affected, you're gone. If you took that WhatsApp video of a mountain caving down and you didn't do a reverse image search, you didn't use your InVid app or on your browser to track where that video first appeared, because there are techniques to do that now. And at MIC, we have done training on that. And you run with that. And somebody from the same area call and say, but where that's supposed to be? Where that happened? When they had the earthquake in 2018, and then there was a video making the rounds of an entire hillside coming crashing down into the sea. That was Philippines, 19th, whatever year. Not Trinidad and Tobago, 2018. Okay, let's keep our online audience in mind.
Well, I think in the time with these wars going on, there's a lot circulating on social media that purports to be from Ukraine or Gaza or so on. And it turns out to be Syria several years ago, you know, and I think I know war is a completely different kind of scenario, but in a way there are similarities with disasters, and the same kind of thing is happening. Perhaps it just occurred to me. Anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have 2 online, right? Okay. Okay.
Deidre, you could go ahead with your
Deidre?
question.
Who else we have?
Jocko, Deidre.
Can I go ahead?
Can we hearing you?
Okay, so yeah, this is Jaka. I just wanted to chime in on what you were saying about the newspaper choosing to omit the name of the individual given their class. In the BVI, we're facing a situation where, given investigations into the COI, there's been a lot of charges of high-ranking public officials and politicians. And what's happening is that the police force is refusing to release the names of these people when they're charged. But the following day, we'll get a press release with the name of a 17-year-old who stole a car or something, and their information is not being secured in the same way. So it's difficult navigating that. I'm wondering if you have any advice in navigating those areas.
No, well, I mean, one, certainly a child, and in most jurisdictions now it's under 18. I don't know if here it's 16 or some countries it's still 16. It's 18. Under 16. Yeah. But I mean, the UN standard is 18, but not all countries have brought their legislation in line with that. But it's 18 here. Right. Well, okay, now that's another thing, because you have sexual offenses and then you have legislation that's specifically on children and identifying children who are so, but it's something to bear in mind. Yes. So that is a question of not only ethics, but of breaking the law. And in my view, if you're a journalist and you're covering the story with the COI, and I don't know the details of that, and you are aware of the names of the people who are charged, publish it. Publish it. I mean, the authorities, if they come to, they have a very serious freedom of the press issue to attend to, unless, of course, you can have judicial action, right? So a judge may decide that that he or she imposes a restriction on identifying the name of an accused, and you're obliged to adhere to that. We have an instance in Trinidad and Tobago where 2 journalists spent a night or 2 in police lockup after breaching the order of a judge not to report on the evidence of somebody who was prosecuted but turned state witness, and they named the person in the reporting against the order of the court. Now, if there's an order of the court, you're obliged to adhere to it. Now, of course, there's no such inhibition on the part of somebody named Jane Thomas, who has a Twitter account, who opened 5 days ago, no followers, follows nobody, or they might have 5 followers, and they put the name, and that kind of thing happens all the time. So yeah, so regarding that, I would say once there is no judicial bar on naming the person, because the police are not the court. They are not the court. They cannot impose a judicial bar on identifying unless there's a specific law that says, okay, as a juvenile, you cannot be identified if you're accused of a crime, or if you are a victim or perpetrator of a sexual offense. So that would be my response to that, without knowing the fine details of the COI story.
We have had cases here in Jamaica where the child is a victim of sexual abuse, and the paper chooses not to name any of the parties involved, the parents and so as to protect the child's identity. So they don't name whether the accused, the parents and so they don't give the information because it can lead back to the child.
And in some countries, their sexual offenses legislation specifically prohibits publication of the alleged perpetrator, the accused. So in Trinidad and Tobago, that was the case, but that was lifted some time ago. Now the problem occurs now in cases of incest, and in very small communities where the culprit or the alleged culprit could only be one person, and the alleged victim could only be one person, 11-year-old going to the standard 5, going to the school, that kind of stuff. So the victim needs to be protected, whatever the thing. And that's part of the code anyway. So there might not be a legislative prohibition, but you can make an ethical decision for the protection of the thing. And the same goes in covering crisis situations in terms of identifying victims, because you don't want to overly portray people as victim or poor guy, poor lady, whatever it is, because it's not, sometimes that is not very useful. Minimize, how much time am I at? Okay. So we're looking at minimizing the impact of misinformation, rumors, or propaganda. That goes without saying. Uphold the principles and standards of journalism, and I spoke about some of those as well. So how are you going to do some of this? And Jim covered some of this before. Now this is, as I said, we're crisscrossing communicators and journalists, right? So there needs to be an assessment. So in some instances, I believe, Kiran, at your media house, there is some scenario setting that's done. So what are the likely scenarios that may emerge? Prior to July 27, 1990, nobody in media in Trinidad and Tobago considered that's the scenario of an attempted coup d'etat, a violent attempt to take over the government. So there was nothing. I mean, we were media, I was in Parliament covering, and I was among those ducking and running and dodging bullets, and people were being shot and that kind of stuff. I didn't have, I mean, even though I was in journalism, years and years before that, it did not occur to, I would know what to do if a storm arrives, or if there's an earthquake. We're prone to earthquakes and so on. But nobody ever told me, well, here now, watch out if some bunch of guys come in with guns and start shooting up the place and taking hostages and so on. No what? Yeah, no, there's no problem. I mean, yeah, but the question of protocol did arise after, because I was head of news at the state broadcaster, which was the only broadcast enterprise that remained on the air. And we had to make some very serious decisions because we were under the control of the police and army. They were used because we were within eyesight of the Parliament building, the Red House, we call it, where half of the hostages were held. And so it was a strategic spot militarily. And every single word that was being said on the air, there was somebody with a gun longer than you standing next to it. I mean, it's not that they were saying, don't do this or don't do that, but just that operating in that environment, you needed to know for your own self-preservation and also to preserve your thing. You didn't want to go on there regurgitating lies. When there was announcement, or when we found out about an amnesty, I don't know if those of you are acquainted with that whole story, right? 114 insurgents stormed the Parliament and the television station, the lone television station at the time. Hold people hostage, they killed 30-something people and all that kind of stuff.
I just wanted to mention too that for those of you who are interested in hearing some of the never heard before instances of the coup, CIJN has a podcast. And I think we're the only ones who have a copy of that tape of the negotiation of hostages for sandwiches. But it was very interesting of what happened with the head of the army and the insurrectionist himself. So it might be interesting for you all to listen to, because those are the kinds of situations that arise that you're never fully prepared for.
Yeah, Caribbean island, Islamist militants storm the 114 of them, hold the entire government hostage and all this kind of, and then they negotiated an amnesty, and we found out about it, and then we had to make a decision: should we broadcast this thing? Should we broadcast that? We heard that the water system had been poisoned, that people were going all over the place, the insurgents, and they were putting poison in the reservoirs and so on. What do we do with that information? Now, so you have to use your journal. The one thing journalism teach you is that you don't go wild. The worst thing you could do as a journalist is run wild. So somebody says 50 people drowned down the road, you don't go wild. You try to verify. So we did the best that we can, and we never carried that story. We didn't have social media then. If we had social media then, so that's the other thing. So you develop within your media enterprises and within your institution, communication teams. So you have people designated responsibilities. Okay, so you see about this, you see about that, you see about, and try to anticipate as many different scenarios as possible. In Dominica 2017, we were monitoring the situation there as ACM in terms of the plight of journalists. And so we were helping to get supplies, boots, helmet, raincoats, food, dry food, and that kind of stuff. And until somebody said, but here now, we need some bicycles. Because so many, Peter showed you the photographs, right? Buildings collapsed and the roadblock or whatever it is. You can't even if you remember to fill the tank, you can't go anywhere. So you have to paint the scenarios and learn from each other. I think the Jamaicans, we have a presentation hopefully from people from the emergency management here. Will be that Jamaica has a lot of experience in this thing that I think the rest of the region can learn from. I happened to mosey along here not long after Gilbert. And my first observation coming in was that all of the trees were the same height. How come all the trees get to be the same height and most of them didn't have any leaves? Likewise, Grenada. We went into Grenada a few days after to take supplies for some journalists who were holed up out of the Grenada broadcasting. Not a tree had a leaf on it. Now, what's the impact of that? Among the impacts of that is parched earth, because after, as you know here from Jamaica and elsewhere, you have no leaf, no cover at all for the soil. And the sun, for some reason, comes out more brutal than it usually does. So it's very dry. Water. So we walked the whole set of water, and you know what happened? Because we could not fly back the same day, because it was restricted, we got a flight to come in. Liat decided to fly people in with help. We had to overnight in somebody's house, and we didn't have water. We gave away all the water. And I think Peter said at the last time he spoke about this, cold water. Anybody, Chris, you old enough to remember perhaps this craving for cold water. So you have to anticipate all this. Sorry. Yeah. So for all these things, so a lot of thinking needs to go in this. And somebody said about protocols, the communication protocol. So what's the relationship? And who was it? Somebody earlier talked about the fact that you have multiple stakeholders at play. You have your emergency management agencies, and depending on the environment you come from, you may have local bodies some of them non-governmental. In fact, in some countries, most of them non-governmental. In Trinidad and Tobago, most are governmental or quasi-governmental because you have a system of local government. And within the local government regions, you have village councils, which tend to be very political. The dominant village councils tend to be political, but that's fine. They do play a role in terms of assisting with relief. The last time we had a huge deluge in Trinidad, these people were mobilizing support. So you had boats going into affected areas with hot doubles, water. There was one popular doubles man from the area that I am from, Curep, and he went on a boat and he was giving out doubles and these things, but still you need to have a level of orderliness, and the emergency management people would usually have a good sense of what they should do. But then you as a journalist going in to cover that, you need to have a good idea of what to do. Last week when we had a session, something like this with the CDMA folks and the folks from Trinidad, they were saying, oh, journalists like to go and do their own thing. So we would take them somewhere and say, you know, we're going this direction, keep on this direction because they have snake, they have water, it might fall, they have nails on the ground, whatever it is. And the minute they start walking, cameraman gone, so reporter gone the next way, whatever it is, and they vex for that. So, but we need to be aware. I think some of that needs to happen because you're not there to do necessarily. Because again, this whole thing, you know, the official agencies, they have also a mandate to ensure that you preserve a certain image of what's happening. Okay, so that whoever it is will come on the air and say, oh, things are under control. We are back in business. I remember that post. Where was it? Was it Barbados, Sanka? It was a hurricane situation, and not the government. We all have the record here, right? The Caribbean Tourism Organization issued a release saying it was St. Lucia, our country. For St. Lucia is open for business. And they were saying that when we knew that bodies were being recovered down in Viewfort, that's when the Rasta guy, and I can't remember how many people were killed, and their bodies were still being excavated from a landslide, right? And the city, so I play fast on myself and I contacted the then communication person at CTO and said, what the hell are you doing? You know, because you as a matter of self-interest, you will lose credibility. How can you declare back to business and bodies are still being excavated from a land? Things like that. So Jim spoke about the crisis communication toolkit. For communicators, it's important that you have that and that you stick to it. Journalists, your newsroom need to have these guidelines. The ACM worked on a document some time ago, and Kiran is going to address some of this because we think that there's need to propose a new set of guidelines for newsrooms so that people will know what goes into your communication, crisis communication toolkit, your contact details and so on. And then you need to give it a test run every now and then. So what did they put? I'm going to close with this, Kiran. Potential hazards at a national level. Bearing in mind what Franklin said about the fact that in some countries, small as they are, because St. Vincent and the Grenadines, when there was the volcanic episode, the directly affected part of the islands, really mainly up in the north. But yes, there were ash flows and whatever it is that affected the southern part, which is where you find Kingstown, and some even reached Beckway, which is south of Kingston, right? And so not all of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Similarly, situation in Tobago now, it is not all of Tobago. It's not everywhere you're going to Tobago. So, but you need to know that there might be uneven impacts, and your reporting on it needs to reflect the uneven impacts. You have natural disasters, hurricanes, flood, humanitarian emergencies, forced migration. What we were speaking about Haiti, and Jamaica and the Bahamas, Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, Aruba, Curacao. Curacao probably has taken in more people per capita than anywhere else because very small island. And so, so you have to deal with that as a human. West Africans, yes. Yeah, with Liberians and so on. So those are things that now you may not use the word emergency or crisis or because journalistically you might be portraying the story, what's happening as not at the level of the collapse of your economy or the collapse of your country or overstressing of the resources of the country. Because in Trinidad and Tobago, with the situation with Venezuelan migrants, we have been very careful in terms of the languaging of the situation, not to use terms like influx, invasion, and those things. So you need to have those things in mind while covering it. And hopefully you have newsroom leadership that's pointing you in that direction. Yeah, exactly. But no, but there, no. Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, we don't want it to come across as they're just coming to, take up space in the country.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and we have to be very careful. I mean, there again, we come to official terminology and how we reflect the problem. Not everybody who comes will be a refugee. Not everybody will be an asylum seeker. Some people might be bona fide migrants who want to come and seek economic, international migration conventions do not consider economic refugees to be the same as the refugees who are fleeing because of the threat of physical harm and that kind of stuff. So you need to be aware of that. At MIC, we have done training on that in terms of how journalists should really be reporting these things so that you don't fuel xenophobia, discrimination, and negative stereotyping of people who come from somewhere else. And Kiran is making away slowly. They have political, social actions, upheavals, riots. It's not inconceivable because we have had attempted coup before Trinidad and Tobago. You had Dominica. You had Grenada, 1979 to 1983. And there was a lot of clumsiness in terms of how we address that. How do you really report? How do you, was recognition of CARICOM of 1979-83 in Grenada, and I want to use that kind of thing. Was that the cue for a certain kind of reporting? So are we talking about the government of Grenada and things like that? And then you have outright media crackdown, censorship, arrests, threats, closures, and that's happening all over the world. I do a lot of work on that through IFEX and the Global Forum for Media Development, where we're seeing a growing number of cases where countries are confronted by this, and not all the time the ostensible reason by officialdom for clamping down on media, on the face of it, dishonorable. Because they might be doing this, as they say, and some early signs were in Venezuela. Chavez talked about the first set of oppressive media law that went into in Venezuela had to do with the protection of children in broadcasts. Who could be against that? But it was the thin end of a wedge that went into the situation now where you really don't have a free press in Venezuela. So these are things that we need to be careful of, and that's why at the very first slide or the second slide, I said that all of this does not mean that we are going to be prepared to give up freedom of expression and the right to information. It's a right, it's not a privilege. And in some instances, in some countries, it's written not necessarily into law, but into the agreements we have made with the world community. The SDGs, for example, SDG 1610 talks about a regime for the freer flow of information so that people can make informed decisions to protect themselves against the worst effects of economic and other challenges that they face. So those are things, and I didn't get into it, but Kiran is going to get into the details now about this. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, Wesley. All right, so I'm gonna pull up the PDF. Developing a risk assessment. It's minimized on the bottom, I think. Right. Right. Okay, so this is the fun part of the afternoon because you all are going to be divided into groups as we progress through this presentation. So just for everybody to understand, right, there are 10 elements of a crisis management plan. I listed them here. You hear big companies always talk about their crisis management plan, but I find it's something that we fall short on as media houses. So by show of hands, who here has hold on. Okay, sharing now? Right. Show of hands, who here has a crisis management plan with all 10 elements in them? What about online? Look through them. Risk analysis, activation protocol, chain of command, command center plan, response action plan, internal communications, external communications, resources, training, reviews. And I don't think any of us could put up our hands, right? So it shows where we are. So I would like to know how many of you in room and online have conducted an organizational, just the organizational risk assessment, looking into main threats and risks to your organization and its individuals who are exposed. Show of hands.
Please note that we're not seeing the screen.
Hold on. That's yes, well, yes, if you're an individual, it would count. But if you're part of an organization, I would like to know as well. So show of hands, who in their media outfits, right? So one. What about online? Anybody online have their hands up who have done organizational?
We're not seeing that screen.
Then Jim said they're not seeing the screen. Okay.
But no, we don't have any 10-point plans out here.
I'm sorry to say that MIC doesn't either. We're supposed to be following our own teaching. It's saying paused, so they're trying to figure it out. Let's stop sharing. Let's try and share again. And take it from the right. Everybody seeing it now? Jim, can you see it?
Have you conducted an organizational risk assessment?
Correct.
That
Okay.
that screen we're seeing.
Right, that's the correct
It's still,
one.
it's still not complete, but
Okay, they're trying to sort it out. But yes, that is the question. So I'll just like to move along. Now this isn't working. Okay, so we were having some problems, right? So I'm getting some help to share the slide, okay? Next one. Right. All right, in the newsroom. So we know nobody's done an well, one person has done organizational risk assessment, but let's look at the newsrooms themselves. In your newsrooms, is there any commissioning by editors, journalists, photographers, freelancers, where you use risk assessments and communications plans as part of your news production? We have one person here who has done it personally. For show of hands. So in room 2, that's good. What about online? Anybody online? So this is specific to newsrooms. Nobody online? Okay. So risk assessment is really about taking a look at the organization, at the people, and understanding when there is a situation of crisis, how do you handle it? So I walked with a manual, and I guess some of them online, you all could probably see. This is the one that my newsroom entity has. It's about 25 years old. Some aspects do need to be updated, but this is something that every member of the organization has access to. And it tells them what kinds of disasters could strike, how you handle it, and how you communicate to the public. What is interesting is that I made a couple of calls before coming here to find out if some of our news entities back in Trinidad have this. A lot of them don't. And I wanted to ask if any of you had it, because I think it's something that as a group across the region, we should be seriously looking at, right? Especially now where we see there are other types of disasters, especially when it comes to health and what can happen coming out of the pandemic. But I think it's a good idea for us to have it. So when we look at risk assessments, I decide that this is how I look at it. I put it into 4 buckets: people, property, plant, and equipment. Anybody here who's into accounts or finance at their organizations would love that. Procedures and policy, and then public engagement. So when you're looking at how you're doing your risk assessments, there are internal and external assessments to be done. But I looked at what are the top 10 questions. The top 10 would be, what are the hazards? What is the area impacted? Who is involved? What equipment is impacted or needed? Kenton talked a little bit about that this morning, coming out of his experience. What about the circumstances? A scan of the situation, the potential harm that exists, how to mitigate risks, who is help needed from, is all the staff aware, and what is plan B? So very often as organizations, whether it's the newsroom and news crews or whether it is the operational side of the business, they always have a plan A, but there's hardly ever any plan B. And one of the things that we learned coming out of the pandemic is that you need to look at all of the situations and scenarios. And it's something that we don't do enough of in our region. BBC has some recommendations, and going through BBC, Reuters, Associated Press, and a couple of the others, I always reference BBC because I think when it comes to this, they have put it down in the best systematic way. And a couple of the things they recommend you look at when you're doing your crisis management plan is that you have to identify what could go wrong. Any and all things that could go wrong. It means that you have to sit with the staff and say to them, okay, guys, tell us all the things that could possibly go wrong here from all of the departmental perspectives. Identify who might be affected and how they might be harmed, the controls that are needed to stop it from going wrong. Show that any remaining risk after all of those controls are in place, or that you have a very low risk factor that's acceptable enough. Record all of your findings and keep it. Tell everyone what they need to know and do. Make sure it all gets done. And when they say make sure it all gets done, when you have to plan, this plan is not something you do once every 3 years. This is something that should be at least annual, that you need to review at least annually. In our area, in our region, we know when we're most prone to hurricanes, for example. The best time to do this is like a February, a January or February. I mean, in our building, I remember, you know, we have sheets of plywood. It's not a full sheet of plywood, it's cut in half. And there are little holes in them, and there are the screws in the walls. Anybody, the weakest person in the building, could put up that plywood to cover the glass windows, for instance. We have a cupboard that's just stocked with food supplies in case of an emergency, you know, and the office administrator is the person responsible to check the expiry dates. We have 2 cots in the cupboard in case announcers have to stay there and sleep overnight. I mean, so this is something that is real, but it's something that we have had to use, unfortunately, in the past. And it's something that's real for us. We're feeling a lot of earthquakes in this region, for instance. We don't know when a big one would strike, you know. And based on the information ecosystem assessments that have been done in Barbados and Dominica, and I think it's the same for the region, people get information from 2 places right now: social media and radio. Radios never go off, even when a newspaper can't be printed and delivered because there's a disaster. Even when TV crews can't go out, people will always have their radio. Radios won't switch off. So it's very, very important for us in the Caribbean. When it comes to your people, they are the most important part of any organization. The organization can't run without them. So you need to understand what is the scenario when a disaster strikes. The scenario meaning what happens to the person answering the phone where all the phone calls might come. Does that person have a script? Does that person know to say, okay, you're flooded out, you've seen an electrical wire, and here's a listener or a viewer calling for help. You need to say, okay, don't go into the water. Stand back, stand on something rubberized, you know. Do they have a talk script? Because that person answering the phone is just as important as the person in the newsroom at that time or as the on-air host, right? Where is the staff? Disaster strikes, where is all of the staff? What is the assembly point? Do you have a muster point in the organization? What do you need to provide from an HSC perspective? Do you have a contact list of all the personnel to know where they are? What is the communication process and procedure for disaster strikes? Who is on top? Who is the person that calls all the staff? Who is the person who's going to deploy staff? Who is the person who's going to help field the calls coming in from our public? Think first aid, food, water, sleeping arrangements, backup power, families. Do you all know where the first aid kit is in your office? Yes, show of hands. Somebody's asking, do they have a first aid kit? Our first aid kit is on top of the fridge. One in the kitchen upstairs, one in the kitchen downstairs. But there should be a first aid kit. Who knows first aid in the organization? Who knows how to tie a figure 8 bandage? Do you have people who are first aid qualified? Are your journalists first aid qualified? Any journalists here? Bandits for cuts from opening a jar. Okay.
But how often? Sorry, I was saying that you raised about first aid, the first aid kit, and I'm seeing a lot of people once they get the first aid kit, okay, mission accomplished. We have the first aid kit now, we're good. But how often do you check the first aid kit to make sure that the items in it are not expired or don't need to be replaced and so forth? So there are different levels to it. And just a plug, by the way, that the Red Cross offers first aid training and disaster response and risk management and all of these.
So we could get free training. The journalists could get free training.
Well, as you know, the Red Cross we need money. So some of these courses are
so you will accept a donation.
But so you can talk to our resource mobilization administrator for the details, but just a plug.
Great. So what about online? Any journalists there know first aid training? Sam is yes. Only one out of 40 something. Linda. I mean, that's one of those things I
I've
learned.
done both training.
Oh,
We have a comment in the room.
the Gleaner has a number of members from different departments who are training first aid, and they keep updating the list. So from different departments.
Very good.
Whatever is happening on the list,
That's
they
what
can
we
be-
need to do.
Yeah, different
Exactly.
departments,
Sorry, Kimberly Henry. Good afternoon again, everyone. I'm saying most of the stuff that I know are personal stuff that I'd read or watch a YouTube video or whatever. For me personally, I don't know how to do a CPR if anything should happen. I know if somebody starts hyperventilating to get a paper bag. I know most of the stuff from my grandmother because she's 86, but other than that training, that's absent somewhere.
But you should know how to do a figure of 8 bandage. That's a sling for your arm, and you should know how to have a splint, at least for your leg. You know? Comment online. Let's hear online. Linda?
Well, I did the basic one with the Red Cross. So you learn a bit of CPR, you learn how to do the sling. And so, but I very rarely practice it. So I wondering if something happened and I'm among colleagues, if I could actually execute it. I know I was able to execute it on my hand last Christmas when I cut myself before I ended up going to seek official medical attention. So I don't think I'm so badly off as to compare with others. I think I might be able to handle basic things, including basic swimming.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great team building effort at your office to practice on each other, you know, on lunch times. You get some training, you practice on each other, but I do think it's a necessary thing. Let's move to property and equipment, infrastructure, power and water, access and exit points, contamination checks, communication process and equipment. And the reason why this is important is, let's say there is an earthquake and a pipeline bursts. Sometimes your water out of your tap is going to be mixed with your sewage water, not the sewage that Wesley was talking about earlier, but sewage seems to be very thematic today. So you have to know, what do you do in that circumstance? Does the office, does your newsroom have a backup supply of water? Do you need to have water purification tabs stocked in the medical cabinet or in the first aid kits? What about electricity? If you're in a building and there's an earthquake and the gas lines blew, what happens? What happens to electrical power? Do we have backup generators? What if the fuel tank shakes and it gets loose and there's no fuel in the fuel tank? How are you getting the news out? Are you going to be using your apps? How are you going to communicate, right? I said to somebody earlier, I am a proponent for ham radio. People who are online, who have probably heard me talk about this before, I still think ham radio is very important in our region because it allows us to communicate. When cell towers go down, I mean, I'm already upset that there's not really any AM radio left, but when cell towers go down, how are we going to communicate? Right, public engagement and coverage. You would think we have this down as media because this is what we do every day, but you would be very surprised that some newsrooms still don't have a complete contact list. A contact list is not just a contact list with the disaster management entities, counselors who are in regions, who are in districts, hospitals, community hospitals, centers, churches, temples, mosques. All of those people become your information sources at a time like this. So you need to think out of the box a little bit with that. Ensure that your journalists have a checklist that's completed. Every journalist is supposed to have a checklist, and the checklist is something that we have one that we just distributed recently, but it basically says, here are all the things if you're going to be reporting in a crisis situation. Here are all the items you need. And these are things that the media house should also have available. There are some items on that the media house just has to have available for the journalists. And there are some things the journalists will always have to have as well. you need to think about when you're doing your plan, how many hours do you need to cater for how many days? Your recommendation is usually 3 to 4 days is what you need to cater for, that you're going to have staff there. And remember, circumstances will be changing. So how are you adapting to the changing circumstances? So you might have electricity now, but then by tomorrow there's none. How are you getting food? How are people going to eat and survive through this? And then let's talk about regional collaboration. Whether this regional collaboration is cross borders for us as countries or whether they're internal based on our districts or parishes, who is in the network? You have to have a network of people, and this should be set up way before a crisis. So now when nothing is happening, you should know, here's your contact person in each of these locations. Here are the locations that are most prone. You know we're prone to earthquakes. You know that the places that are probably going to be impacted would be the areas that are very urbanized and probably don't have proper building codes. So that's where your head should be from now. Who are the people you could reach out to at those times? Who can offer what support? Because you're not just going to need things like medical attention and information for the police. You're going to need other things, right? Who you're going to call if there's debris across the road or in front of the building and you can't get in and out. How do you deal with that? What is the procedure and rules of engagement for your network? So if you know you're going to have stringers and they're going to be there in times of emergency, you should already know what your agreement is going to be with them. If you are doing stringing for a larger news organization, you should already be able to say to them, here are the specifics of my agreement with you. Don't wait for a disaster to happen. And then what is the form of collaborative coverage? Are you all going to be giving each other credits? Is your name going to be called? Is it 2 media houses coming together? Figure that out before it happens. And the financial arrangements. I know during a time of disaster is the last thing on anybody's mind, but you know what happens right after? That son of a so-and-so use me for free. No, let's sort all of this out before. There is a media organization safety self-assessment, and that link will be shared with everyone. But there are a couple of key takeaways from it. Have a clear procedure or mechanism in place for all the players to provide input to your protocols and raise the safety concerns. If you haven't done that, you're not doing an effective risk assessment to be resilient as a media entity in a time of crisis. Collect feedback from the individuals implementing the protocols. Reach out to news managers, your commissioning editors and journalists, including your regular freelancers and your stringers. And then what about the psychological safety? This is something we don't think about sufficiently, right? Journalists go through a lot of pain after they cover certain things. And there are images and there are sounds that will never leave us. And as media houses, we need to understand how we deal with that. Digital security needs, very, very important. It's very useful that we have technology to help us, but are we backing up and using the technology the way we should? And then working with freelancers, fixers, and other contributors. What are the specifics of those? So this was just to get your energy going, because what we're going to do is to break into 2 groups. So online, you're going to have 2 breakout rooms. And in the room, we're just going to split the room down half this way, half that way. And this is what we're going to do. One group is going to tackle risk assessment questions for the organization. So you're thinking of it as your media house. And the other group is going to do the risk assessment questions for newsroom staff, your journalists, your camera crew, and so on. So I'm going to give you all 20 minutes, which will take us to about 3:20, 4:20 in Trinidad, so no more than 20 minutes. And then we're going to come back together and hear some of the questions you all would ask in this brainstorming exercise. Okay, so in the room to my right, you all will do the newsroom. And to my left, you all will do the organization. Okay? All right, let's go. 2 breakout rooms online. Breakout room 1 will be doing the journalist, and breakout room 2 online will be the organization. And you'll just come up with the questions for your risk assessment. Okay, so we're going to go to online first. So there would have been 2 groups online, and the first thing we're going to talk about with the online group is we're going to go to the journalist risk assessment. So let's hear some of the questions. If you raise your hand, we'll be able to tell. Can we bring the gallery up on the main screen, please, so we could see who raises their hand? Okay, so now we could see everyone online, and you all can see the room. Okay, so online folks, let's hear from you. Who wants to go first with risk assessment questions you would ask as a journalist or in your newsroom?
Farah, I think you were writing down the list for group 1.
Okay, so I would have missed the question, but we did come up with a list of things that we would need to ensure are in place.
Okay.
And some of them are to meet with emergency management authorities ahead of time so that we can establish how we will operate in times of crises. Make sure that all staff have basic first aid training as well as personal and newsroom medical kits. Have ham radios and other portable communication equipment on hand. Have a generator and other power sources available. Decide where we will work from if the office or newsroom is damaged, and create shifts. Decide if you're going to work from home, a hotel, or the NEOC. Have water and food supplies for 3 days, flashlights, rain gear, and other emergency supplies.
Okay, so you didn't have any questions. I mean, as a group in the newsroom, is there any? So you told us some of the things you would have. So some of that relates to your processes that you would have to work out. But were there any questions? A journalist going into the field covering a crisis. Any questions that would come up? If not from Farah, anybody else?
I would like to take this opportunity to apologize. I missed what the actual question was and simply took notes following or during our discussions. So I feel like I definitely gave the wrong answer to what was asked. But if a journalist would be going out in the field following this, we definitely want to have the answers to what, where, when, why, and who.
Okay. So that will relate to getting the story more than the actual risk assessment. So let's hear from the room. Let's come to the room now. Inside of here, we had a group who were developing the risk assessment questions for journalists. So who from the group wants to go? Please put on the microphone so the folks online can hear you. Okay, let's hear. Go ahead. This is a learning process, so we're all learning.
Okay, so we did something similar, but not directly. So what we did was we gathered the questions that we would ask we gathered the questions that we would ask the members of our newsroom. For example, what are your skill sets and what are your capabilities to perform certain duties? That way we would know who has better strength, where their strengths are for each person, who can swim, who can drive, who can run fast, stuff like that. What areas are each person coming from and going to, so that we would know the geographical placement of each staff member during that time.
Good.
How many hours each person can work depending on what family responsibilities they may have. That would come into shift. Do you know sign language or any other language aside from their main or basic language used in that area? Do you know where each access and exit point is for the newsroom itself? Does each person know how to use a first aid kit? Does everyone have their PPE, and is there backup materials such as batteries available? Does everyone have training for emergencies and drills? Do we do regular drills in the area, or well, in the newsroom? We also talked about risks or hazards that the building can be affected by, such as floods and so on in the area. But I feel like we also missed the point.
No, I mean you had
overnight stay.
so I mean the point about the run, swim, that kind of thing. I mean, one of the things that you should be asking is the medical condition.
We
of
also have that.
everybody.
We
right,
also have that.
Right. So because in situations like that too, where you may have journalists who have to go on assignment outside,
Yes.
you want to make sure they have, you know, whether it's the asthmatic, do they have what they
We
need?
talked about
If
that.
they're
We have that
diabetic,
on our list.
what is a very important question, and it sometimes is missed, and you end up in bad situations. So if that is a case, then you need to know, okay, these
Yeah,
journalists
we
are going out, two of them have this illness, and here's the drugstore. Who knows? They have to have that backup supply in case they need it. I mean, down to that, that's the kind of stuff that you
Yeah.
need to get into. Other risk assessment questions for journalists and newsroom staff? Anybody else? Anybody online? Anything came to anyone's mind you want to add? Use the microphone, please.
Sorry, we spoke about contact information, sharing, you know, and we also spoke about overnight stay in the newsroom, whether we have a bed, shower to shower, and we also spoke about in studio.
There's probably not going to be a shower, so wet wipes. Anything else? Anybody online wants to add anything? Can we go back to the gallery?
We also spoke about in the event of if we have a security breach in the newsroom, as in somebody gets access in while we are supposed to be on lockdown.
Mm-hmm. Good. I don't know if any folks online want to raise their hand and add anything. No? Okay, well, let's go to the organization now. So let's go online to, that would have been breakout room 2. I see Jaka has her hand up. Jaka, you want to say something?
Oh, I was the one taking the notes for breakout room 2, so I'll just raising my hand.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Okay, so we had a very thorough discussion, but we did get all our questions down. So questions we would consider when putting together our plan would be, what are the potential hazards that could affect our organization? What are the potential impacts of each hazard? So considering things like hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis, data breaches. How long can the organization afford to be out of operation? What resources need to be acquired to support emergency response plans, and how should those resources be managed? We'd also consider who has insight over those resources. What mitigative training is needed for staff, and what agencies need to be engaged for this training? What does staff need to know before, during, and after a disaster? And how will this information be distributed? What are the medical needs of staff or dietary needs? What mental and emotional support may be needed following a traumatic incident? What is in place to shelter staff in place of an emergency? What is plan B for relocating staff if our building is compromised? And what roles need to exist on an emergency team? Under that, we also have, how are these roles, how are these responsibilities assigned, and who is responsible for what?
Good, very good. So in other words, if you have an earthquake, you know who is going to do the inspection of the building or the office, right?
Yes.
Right. Okay, good. So let's go to the room. Okay, we have one question. In room microphone, please. One question from CARIMAC. Go ahead.
Not a question, Kiran, but a point that we missed out that my colleagues pointed out. We also spoke about technology for journalists in the event that you go on the road to cover a story and you perhaps might get hung by a cord. That could be avoided if you had a mic, a cordless mic.
Good. So you have to prepare for galoshes, right? Rubber boots in crisis situations, right? Heels not gonna cut it. Yeah. So down to footwear. So clothing when you're covering is important. Okay, organization. Let's go to in room here. Who's
All
gonna
right.
speak?
Yes, Ursil reporting on behalf of what's the name of the group? The group.
The group.
All right.
Woohoo!
All right. So, well, in terms of questions, our first would be of location. So, where are we located? The risk will differ based on where we are. So, Antigua, Barbuda, as opposed to Barbados. If we're on a main thoroughfare, as opposed to being on a side road. If we're in a high-rise building, as opposed to being on the ground level. So, issues of location would be the first. And of course, that would affect our propensity to the various natural hazards of which we spoke. So, for example, whichever island we're in may make us more susceptible to hurricanes as opposed to volcanoes. They're not in Antigua Barbuda that we know of. Some are on an earthquake belt. Some are exposed to, flooding, etc. So, location for us would be the first question, and then hazard identification would be the second question. Then we talked about infrastructure, what we currently have in place, and how reliable it is. In the Caribbean, internet, I think, seems to be a troubling issue for a lot of our Caribbean territories. So we have to assess internet, electricity, telephone, and water supply. For our country, Alex will tell you, elections are won and lost on the provision of water. So that's a major issue that we look at as well. And in infrastructure, how do we maintain, or what do we do should the infrastructure fail? So we have how we would keep communication systems going. For example, some sort of link is the one I think that was most suggested. Do we have to resort to walkie-talkies if we don't have telephones? Do reporters have charged phones before a hurricane hits, for example? Those are questions that we have to ask ourselves as well. If we have water tanks, but the question was also asked, if we don't have any electricity, how do we get water from water tanks? We just go with a bucket and do the old-fashioned thing. Backup bathroom facilities, generators, of course, and of course having fuel for generators. So whether kerosene, diesel, gasoline, issues of lighting, cooling would be important here as well. And waste disposal, very important. We need to maintain some quality of existence even through a natural disaster, a natural hazard, sorry. And then transportation, we thought about as well. So access to and from the building, and then access, I guess, throughout the building. If you're, in terms of the location, we talked about the building code. So we talked about issues of emergency exits that would have come into play when the buildings went up, so to speak. And evacuation plans, having those in place would be important as well. And finally, there'll be no plants and property without the people. So we want to focus on them as well, having health and safety committees in place, first aid kits, those trained to use them, adequate food and water, standard operating procedures, manuals, debriefing exercises was one of the things that was mentioned as well. And having, general more things than the usual first aid kit would have, defibrillators. We also mentioned EpiPens as well. So things of that nature. Not sure if I missed anything from the group. the group is good.
Okay, good. So so should we have, yeah, so do you all think newsrooms should have satellite phones? How many newsrooms here have satellite phones? So let's see online. Show of hands. Could we go to the gallery view? The online gallery view so we can see show of hands. Which newsrooms have satellite phones? And here one, only one. Okay, we have, I'm seeing two, Jaka, Farah. Okay, Farah's hand is on satellite phones. We don't really have too many satellite phones. What about satellite links? You all know that they're portable satellite links. It's a foldable panel. It's about probably the size of 3 notepads that you could also link to. You open it, it's a panel. It shoots up. It has a little device that allows you to tune it into your satellite link. Yeah, that does exist. Maybe that's something we need to look at as an option as well. Maybe it could be a shared piece of equipment. If you know that you're representing, you know, a group of you who are going to be reporting in a time of a disaster. But those are the things that have to be spoken about. Backup bathroom facilities, what would that be? Out of curiosity, what does that look like?
Find a room.
Outside.
Porta potties inside.
So this is so there actually are portable toilets that look like a bucket and they use a garbage bag. And they use them on camping trips. They use them on camping trips. But that's one of the things that people use as a backup. Evacuation plans. When you're talking about evacuation plans, you also have to consider every member of staff has to have it and take a page out of a hotel room, stick it up wherever you know people could see it. What happens if a staircase gets caved in? What's your way out? So we had that experience of having to go through a whole plan, and we realized we needed a rope ladder out of one of our windows onto the roof, because the roof of that building, there was a ladder on the side of the building, and that would have been a backup plan if there was no stairwell to use. So I mean, down to those little finer points, we take it for granted. But those are some of the things. Anybody wants to make any comments or add to the list? I mean, I thought this was good, but I mean, I think you all also could tell how much planning we actually do need. And it's something we really need to think about. Any comments from online? No? Well, folks, Emma, a microphone for Emma, please, in room.
Just one thing I think we mentioned in passing on this side, but maybe it needs to be emphasized, is the risk of fire. And I don't know, because fire can happen in all kinds of situations, crises. Something can catch fire, or especially an earthquake, for example. It's very common for fires to start. So maybe we need to pay attention to that as well.
So fire extinguishers, how many entities have fire extinguishers and they know where they are in their offices? Show of hands. Few in this room. What about online? Oh, Marlon, Jaka, Candice, Farah. Not as many hands as I would like to see. How you know, oh yeah, and if you know how to use them, that's another team building effort. Okay, so folks, this definitely shows us one thing, right? That we all need to do our risk assessment plans for our organizations and newsrooms and journalists. It's a serious thing. You know, my nightmare is earthquakes, because our region was built on 2 tectonic plates rubbing together and creating islands. And if you all monitor what is happening with the seismic activity, it has just been building and building. and chances are that somebody is going to have a serious earthquake. Apart from that, we all know hurricanes are inevitable in our region. And what do we do? And what happens if there's a super hurricane? And you all will hear more about tsunamis, because where there are earthquakes and where there are hurricanes, you probably will be getting tsunamis. So we need to take all of the precautions. So folks, thank you all very much. I thought that your brains were all in gear for an afternoon. I was very surprised. I didn't expect as many great answers as we got. We will see you all tomorrow. We are back at 9 a.m. Jamaica time, 10 a.m. Eastern Caribbean time. And we're going to start tomorrow with one of my favorite simulations that I've come across, because it is a simulation on the earthquake in Haiti. And it's one of the only ones ever done for our region. And we're actually going to look at that simulation and see actual pictures. And you will be placed into the scenarios as journalists, and it's going to ask you what you would do. So we start off the morning, very exciting tomorrow. And that is going to be followed up with a simulation press conference out of that exercise. So thank you all. Get home safely, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Bye to the folks online.